Chapter 161. A few days later, the Tara Street magistrate received a report. In a small house in a remote street under their jurisdiction, there was a highly decomposed body soaked in a wooden barrel. The first person to find the body was a nearby neighbor. In a long time of fine weather, the rotten smell of the body came out and exposed the body. When the people from the magistrate hurriedly arrived, they immediately saw a horrifying scene. This highly decomposed corpse was sitting upright in the wooden barrel. His hands were clasped together as if he was praying. There were 2 steel nails pierced through his chest. The magistrate recognized the clothes of the corpse at a glance. It was the deacon uniform of the magistrate. This was like a deep water bomb, causing great waves. After identifying the identity of the body, all the magistrate branches in the entire commercial district were alarmed. As a top force independent of the aristocracy, the military and the Holy Church, this was the most serious trauma and provocation suffered by the magistrate in the past 5 years. For a time, the magistrate put this case on the highest execution list. The day after Huey's body was found, people found another highly decomposed body in a sewer outside the magistrate. After identification, it was Huey's coachman. The investigators sent by the magistrate found the owner of the house in the first place. He was a fat middle-aged man. When he was brought into the magistrate's interrogation room, he was scared to the point of collapse. "Where were you at 8 o'clock on the 17th? "At home. It was raining heavily. I was with my family. I heard that your house was rented out. Do you remember the appearance of the renter?" "I don't remember. He was wearing a hood and kept his head down. It was too dark, so I didn't pay much attention. But I remember that his body was very thin." "When you signed the lease contract, didn't you see his identity card?" "I asked him for it, but he said he didn't have it with him. Later, he said he would only rent it for a week. He gave me 10 silver coins. I rented it to him." "Humph, a money grubber." In the investigation of the owner of the house, the magistrate obtained very limited information. The only thing they could confirm was that the murderer was a man and it was a planned and premeditated assassination. However, the magistrate naturally wouldn't let go of the death of a deacon. The corpse and the scene were tightly protected. The magistrate transferred 2 senior knights to investigate the information left by the murderer. The first thing that caught their attention was the 2 steel nails. They were sent to the magistrate for inspection. It didn't take long for them to find 2 kinds of blood stains on the steel nails. One was Huey's and the other was unknown blood. Although they could not find the murderer through the blood, the magistrate quickly found the source of the steel nails, Thornflower Prison. In addition to the steel nails, the magistrate also found a few rose petals at the scene. Therefore, all the flower beds and flower shops on Tara Street were strictly inspected. On the other side of the business district, Yard Town, a carriage drove in and stopped in front of an inn. A pale-skinned youth alighted from the carriage and entered the inn with a bouquet of crimson roses in his hands. Dong dong. The door opened. "Dean." Joseph was pleasantly surprised when he saw Dudian. "Come in, you finally came back." Dudian entered the spacious room. Joseph was the only one in the room. He asked, "Barton and Crone?" "They went to collect information. They will be back soon." Joseph was surprised when he saw Dudian holding the flowers. "Why did you change it? The previous ones have withered." Dean smiled and poured himself a cup of hot tea. After a moment he smelled Barton and Crone appearing in his perception range. Both of them returned to the hotel. "How was it?" Dudian asked them. Barton and Crone were surprised to see Dudian. It was as if they had found their backbone. Both of them looked at each other. Barton said, "These days we have asked everywhere, from butchers to shop owners. They said that the Ryan family is a small aristocratic family. The patriarch is called Fuline Ryan. He is 62 years old. His wife died a long time ago. He has 4 children. The eldest son is 48 years old." Dean listened to the information from the 2. Due to the decline of the Ryan family, There are only 2 teams of knights in the Ryan family. Each team has 10 knights and around 30 squires, for a total of 50 people. Moreover, I heard that many of these knights aren't regular knights, so they haven't received a Medal of Honor from the Knights' Hall. It's just that the old patriarch wanted to save face, so he recruited some apprentice knights into the team to increase the number of knights and make it look better. After a moment, all 3 of them finished talking. Dudian nodded. He got up and said, "Wait for me here. I'm going out." "Where?" Barton asked. Dudian smiled. "I'm going to visit the patriarch." The night came. The castle on the high slope outside the town was brightly lit. Knights and squires were on duty in every corner of the castle. The work of guarding the castle day after day was extremely boring, and they were already tired of seeing the scenery that was always repeating itself. Furthermore, the guards all knew that even the stupidest thief would not come here to look for treasures. It was no different from looking for water in the desert or fire in the ocean. The guards stood together and chatted about interesting things they had heard recently. They wanted the night to pass as soon as possible. In the huge dining hall of the castle, old Foulin was sitting at the head of the long table. His children and grandchildren were sitting on both sides of the table. One of the older granddaughters was handing her baby to the nanny so that she could take it to breastfeed. A huge chandelier was hanging on the top of the dining table. The oil lamp was yellow. It was the lamp oil used by ordinary residents. After dinner, the children got up and saluted the old patriarch. They went back to their respective rooms to rest or play. "Grandpa, I mentioned to you last time about opening a shop on Wall Street. What do you think?" One of the young men, who was about 20 years old, asked the old patriarch who was sitting at the head of the table. Old Foulin slowly looked up at him. "I have investigated. Although Wall Street is bustling but the rent is too high. The profit you want to sell is too low. It's not enough to earn back the rent, let alone make money to subsidize your family." The young man's face slightly changed. "Grandpa, I don't want to sell junk. I have found a master craftsman to forge good swords and knives. I can sell them at a high price. As long as you lend me some money to rent the shop, I will definitely make a profit." "You are too young." Old Foulin sighed. "You go and investigate the other shops near Wall Street. If you think that the things you sell are better than the other shops, then come back to me. Don't treat the customers as fools. They are very smart." "Grandpa," the young man hurriedly said. "Hugh, don't be rude," the middle-aged man next to him shouted. The young man lowered his head and threw away the fork in his hand. He turned away and left. The middle-aged man looked at the old patriarch. "Father, please don't be offended. The child is not sensible and impatient. He is still young. After a few years of tempering, he will understand." Old Foulin sighed but didn't say anything. He picked up the crutches from the table and got up. The maid next to him helped him back to the room. Old Foulin covered his chest and coughed softly. The middle-aged maid next to him quickly took out a bottle from the container and handed it to him. The old patriarch poured out 2 red pills and swallowed them. His cough eased a little. He waved his hand to let the maid withdraw. The middle-aged maid withdrew. Old Foulin slowly came to the desk next to the bed. He lit the oil lamp and took out a magnifying glass from the drawer. He started to read the books on the table. "Patriarch, you are in a good mood." Suddenly a voice echoed from the dark corner of the room. Chapter 162. Old Foulin was startled as he heard the sudden voice. He slowly raised his head. His eyes fell on the dark corner of the room. There was a thin figure behind a large hanger. "I'm afraid you will be disappointed if you are here to steal." Old Foulin's eyes were cold as he slowly put down the magnifying glass. "Patriarch is really smart. You didn't call the guards first." The figure laughed. Old Foulin coldly snorted. "You can sneak into my castle, so your skills shouldn't be inferior to a regular knight. I have my own dog, so I know how fast it is. You will have enough time to kill an old man and then escape." Tell me, what are you planning to do by coming here? The figure stepped out of the shadow. It was Dean. There was a shallow smile on his face. I haven't seen you for 3 years. Patriarch, do you still remember me? Old Fouline's eyes flashed as he saw Dean's face. He didn't expect the intruder to be so young. He said, You should be able to see that I'm old. When people get old, their memory will decline. Please tell me. Dean faintly smiled. 3 years ago, at the aristocratic party held by the Melon Consortium, you invited a scavenger to be your family's knight. Do you remember? Old Fouline was startled. He thought for a moment. His eyes widened as he exclaimed, It's you! It's me. Old Fouline couldn't help but ask, You didn't. He was shocked. Did you escape from prison? Duddian smiled. There seems to be no other way for a small civilian prisoner like me to get out of here. Old Fouline's face turned ugly. I remember that I didn't offend you. I heard that you were imprisoned 3 years ago. If you want to retaliate, then you should look for the Bourron family and the Milan family. Dean smiled as he pulled the chair next to him and sat down. Patriarch, don't be nervous. I have no malice towards you. I just want to talk about cooperation. Cooperation? Old Patriarch said in a low voice. Our Ryan family is just a small family. We only have a small town. The income of the entire Ryan family is not enough to cover the annual expenses of the children of the Bourron family. We really can't help you. Duddian smiled. I didn't come to you for this matter. I naturally know the strength of your Ryan family. Although your Ryan family has declined, but you are still a noble family. I came to find you to bail me out. Bail you out? Old Fouline shook his head. No, you have escaped from prison, so I can't bail you out. If you were still in prison, then I could bail you out. But now you are a wanted criminal. I can only bail you out if you are willing to be caught and go back to prison. Dean smiled. It's just a matter of cost. As long as you spend money to take care of it, I believe that you have a way to remove a wanted order. You overestimate me too much. Old Fouline shook his head. Our Ryan family has no savings. You have seen that all the expensive antiques passed down by our ancestors have been sold. There is nothing valuable left. Now we are relying on the income from the farm to barely maintain our daily expenses. There is no money to help you. Dean whispered, Patriarch, you should know that I am a hunter. If you bail me out, will your family be short of money in the future? Old Fouline smiled. But I really don't have money to help you. If I remember correctly, your family has a mine in Red Leaf Mountain, right? Dean asked with interest. Old Fouline's face changed. You want me to sell the mine? Don't even think about it. This is the last lifeblood of our Ryan family. We will never sell it. Even if you kill me, it will be useless. Dean sighed. Patriarch, I hope that time hasn't eroded your brain and eyes. You have to see clearly what is a real treasure mine and what is a waste mine. What do you mean? Old Fouline's face slightly changed. After I am bailed out and have a legal identity, I will naturally repay your Ryan family. Dean slowly said, If I'm not wrong, the mine has long been exploited to the point that it is no different from an abandoned mine. Otherwise, your Ryan family wouldn't be in such a decline. But I'm different. You should know that the wealth created by a hunter can completely change the current predicament of your Ryan family. Old Fouline's face turned ugly as he shook his head. No, I can't do this. Dean indifferently said, I know what you are worried about. Bailing me out is tantamount to opposing the Bourron and Milan families. It will bring a devastating blow to the already weakened Ryan family. But aren't you on the same side as them? Your Ryan clan is also declining day by day. After 10 years, how many knights can your Ryan clan hire to guard the gate for you? Old Fouline's face turned ugly. He knew that Dean was right. This was the source of his worries and troubles. But it's different if you cooperate with me. Duddian smiled. I can improve the life of your Ryan family. I can even bring your Ryan family back to the glory of the glorious period. Old Fouline suddenly looked up at him. Just by you? Although you are a hunter, but how can I believe that you will know how to repay me after I bail you out? Moreover, I know better than you how much a primary hunter can do. You don't need to confuse me. A primary hunter can't do much. Moreover, how can I bet the fate of my family on a hunter who will die outside the giant wall? Dudian gently smiled. A primary hunter naturally won't do, but what about an intermediate hunter? Old Foulin was startled. He looked at him. What do you mean? Do you remember Linda's team that died 3 years ago? Dudian smiled. Old Foulin froze for a moment. He naturally knew about this. As a member of the Melon Consortium, every time a hunter was killed, the ruling nobles would take action. Moreover, an entire hunting team was annihilated. This matter caused a great sensation at that time. Many investigation teams were sent to search outside the giant wall. However, they couldn't find the reason. They couldn't determine whether it was man-made or a monster. Chapter 163. Did you kill her? Old Foulin was stunned. You should know that I have a problem with Linda. Dudian chuckled. When the consortium investigates, they won't pay attention to me. I'm just a junior hunter. If you investigate, you should be able to find out that I was temporarily dispatched to the giant wall to cooperate with Glenn to hunt the Black Weaver. Old Foulin was startled. When Dudian mentioned Glenn and the Black Weaver, he immediately recalled the major events that happened that year. These two events happened to overlap. You weren't a junior hunter at that time. You were at most an apprentice hunter. How could you kill Linda? She was an intermediate hunter. Old Foulin couldn't believe it. Dudian glanced at his desk and smiled. If you have read the recent newspapers, then you should know about the death of Deacon Huey. Old Foulin was startled. His eyes widened as he looked at Dudian in horror. Yes, I killed him. Dudian smiled. Old Foulin couldn't help but ask. He was a deacon of the magistrate. Why did you kill him? The main reason why I was imprisoned was because of his trial. Dudian smiled. I told you these two things because I want to tell you that if I want to, your Ryan family will be completely destroyed tonight. Please believe me. Old Foulin's pupils contracted as he stared at Dudian. After a long time of silence, he felt tired. His old face was full of sweat. He was no longer able to hide his body's trembling. He slowly sat back on the chair. So, I have no choice? Dudian touched his chin and thought for a moment. Then he shook his head. Well, it seems that there is no choice. Unless you choose to maintain the noble character of an aristocrat and insist on fighting against the criminals. Then you will be gloriously exterminated. Perhaps you will leave a glorious record in the history books of the future generations. At least you won't be ashamed of the ancestors of the Ryan family. Old Foulin smiled. You don't have to be sarcastic to me. You were able to escape from Thornflower Prison. I know that you are not a simple character. Perhaps Linda's team was really killed by you. Anyway, you have the strength to kill an old man like me. Even if it is to save my own life, I will promise you. But if you really killed Deacon Huey, then the magistrate will definitely find out. Even if I bail you out, you will be imprisoned again and will be executed immediately. Dudian smiled. You don't have to worry about this matter. I have my own way to deal with it. Old Foulin couldn't help but look at him. He wanted to say something but hesitated. He finally held back and said, Since you have your own plan, I won't say much. But it is difficult to mine the Red Leaf Mountain. It is almost a waste mine. Even if it is sold, it won't be able to get a high price. Dudian smiled. The mine is the same as a person. As long as you dress up a little, even if it is ugly, you will be able to look good after dressing up. I believe I don't need to elaborate on how to do it. Old Foulin deeply looked at him. I know. Dudian slowly walked to the desk. It's getting late. You can now write the bail letter and send it to the magistrate to submit the bail application. Old Foulin's face slightly changed as he carefully stared at the boy. He sighed in his heart. I can probably believe that Linda and the others really died in your hands. He took out the letter from the drawer and filled the quill with ink. He began to write. Duddian quietly looked at the letter. After a moment, the Ryan family's emblem was stamped at the end. Tomorrow I will find a way to sell the mine to raise money to help you take care of it. Old Foulin sighed as he closed the letter. Duddian nodded and patted his shoulder. Don't worry too much. I'll give you a big gift once you're done with your business. Old Foulin bitterly smiled but didn't say anything. After a moment, Duddian went into hiding. Old Foulin called the butler and handed over the letter. He ordered to send it to the magistrate overnight. Dean hid in the dark and carefully observed. He didn't want Old Foulin to secretly swap the letter. After the butler left, he smelled Old Foulin's scent being transferred to another person's hand. That person rode a horse and left the castle. After the door was closed, Dean came out and looked at Old Patriarch. It's getting late, so I'm going back to sleep. I wish you have a good dream. It's a good start. Old Foulin wryly smiled. He was doomed to have insomnia tonight. The day after Deacon Huey's body was found. Warden's office in the castle of Thornflower Prison. A figure in black armor pushed open the door in a hurry. He glanced around and saw Jones behind the desk. Warden, I heard that you have news about the criminal? Yes. Jones threw a letter on the table to him. This is the news I just got. The kid's trace has been exposed. He is in the commercial district. The black-armored youth quickly opened the letter and read through it. He couldn't help but say, Kill Deacon Huey? Wasn't he in the slums? How could he run to the commercial district? Jones replied, He went to the slums first. It's likely that he deliberately exposed the direction of your search. He wanted you to think that he was hiding in the slums and ignore the search in other areas. The youth in black armor felt as if he had been slapped in the face. There was anger in his eyes. Are you saying that we have been fooled by him? Jones said indifferently. From the moment he escaped from prison, it was tantamount to playing with us. Now you immediately dispatch people to the commercial district to search for his traces. I believe in your nose. Search the entire commercial district, and you will certainly dig him out. The black-armored youth's face was gloomy. Looking at the letter in his hand, he suddenly said, It only says that there are 2 steel nails. These steel nails are not exclusive to our prison. They can be forged in some blacksmith shop. Could it be just a coincidence? If I were him, when I was wanted, I would try my best to lead the people we were searching for to the slums. There is no reason for me to do such a thing in the blink of an eye and expose my whereabouts. Wouldn't the previous plan be in vain? Jones looked at him. Even if he didn't do this, you have searched the slums for so many days and still haven't found his shadow. Sooner or later you will shift your attention to other areas. He should know that there is a possibility that he will be exposed. He also knows that we will search for him. The purpose of doing this is to know where our search team is. He wants to lead us by the nose. The youth in black armor couldn't help but ask, Since you know this, why do you still want me to go? Jones sighed and said, There is no other way. Even if I know what this kid is thinking, I still have to jump in. After all, the one who died is a deacon of the magistrate. At present, the biggest suspect is this kid who escaped from the prison. If we don't do something, how will the magistrate and the nobles trust our prison? The youth in black armor was silent for a moment. I will send some people to go there, and send some people to search the residential area. Jones nodded. Yes, I also have the same idea. But this investigation in the commercial district must be carried out by you. Otherwise, there is no way to give an explanation to the magistrate. I know. The youth in black armor nodded slightly. Chapter 164. Back to the hotel. Barton and the other 2 were relieved to see Duddian come back. Crone gently closed the door and pulled Dean into the room. He whispered, Dean, I accidentally read the newspaper today. A deacon named Huey was killed. He was stabbed by 2 steel nails in the chest. Are you the one who did it? Dudian nodded. Yes. Barton couldn't help but ask, is this the person who put you in prison? Dudian slightly nodded and added, one of them. The three looked at each other. Joseph nervously said, Dean, they are arresting murderers everywhere. Will they suspect you? You are still a wanted man. If you are found, you will be imprisoned again. Dudian comforted the three. Don't worry. I will restore my legal identity in a few days. These things will pass. Restore your legal identity? The three were surprised. How? Crone couldn't help but ask. Dean smiled. It's getting late. Let's rest early. The next day, Dudian let Barton and the other two continue to monitor the Ryan castle. He sneaked into the castle to monitor the actions of the old patriarch. Although the possibility was very low, but he still had to prevent the old patriarch from having other ideas. Dean was gratified that old Foulin was very efficient even though he was old. The next morning he dispatched miners to send the ores back to the Red Leaf Mountain mine. The mine that had been mined out for a long time had turned into a rich mine with high production under the camouflage of the ores. The news of the sale of the mine quickly spread out. However, the first sensation was the Ryan family itself. The 4 children and 9 grandchildren of the old patriarch were in an uproar. Except for a few people who agreed with the approach of the old patriarch, the rest were unanimously against it. The Red Leaf Mountain mine was the last lifeline of the Ryan family. Once it was sold, they would be completely cut off from the source of money. They could only sit and eat. The voices of opposition were soon suppressed by the old patriarch. On the 3rd day, the Red Leaf Mountain mine was sold. It was sold to another aristocrat who had been eyeing the mine for a long time. Dudian felt that he didn't choose the wrong person as he saw the old patriarch's swift and decisive actions. The 5th day evening, old Foulin and his children were having dinner in the dining room. Grandpa, I'm going to attend a noble ladies' party in a few days. My best dress is too old. I bought it 3 years ago. Can you buy me a new one? A girl in her 20s, who was eating steak, suddenly looked up and said to old Foulin. Old Foulin frowned as he glanced at the table. He saw his children and grandchildren secretly looking at him. He snorted. I know that you are thinking about the money from the Red Leaf Mountain mine. This money is used by our family. Don't think that you can spend extravagantly even if the mine is sold. Don't think that we can save. Otherwise we will have our nights. When they heard his harsh words, their expressions changed. Grandpa, are you old and confused? One of the young men stood up in anger. What's the use of the money? It can't be used to make money. It's better to lend it to me to do business. Old Foulin's face changed as he coldly said, You say it again. The middle-aged man next to him hurriedly pulled the young man. Hugh, shut up. The young man saw the old patriarch's gloomy face. He clenched his teeth, threw away the knife and turned to leave. At the same time as he left, a servant ran in and passed him. He came in front of old patriarch and respectfully said, Master, you have a letter. Old Foulin took the letter and glanced at the badge mark on the cover. The anger on his face slightly converged. He grabbed the crutches on the table and said to the middle-aged maid, Help me back to my room. Old Foulin ordered the middle-aged maid to withdraw after entering his room. He came to the desk alone and opened the letter. He looked at the contents and said, Come out, it's for you. Dean's figure emerged from the shadows of the room. There was a smile on his face. Is it a bail notice? Old Foulin nodded and handed the letter to him. Dean opened it and saw that it was a bail notice. It was written in black and white. It was very clear that his bail application had been approved. Sure enough, nobility and money. There's nothing that can't be done. Dean smiled. Old Foulin sat back in his chair and indifferently said, In order to help you, we spent tens of thousands of gold coins from the sale of the mines in Red Leaf Mountain. Ryan family's savings for many years were almost depleted. We were able to withdraw your wanted order and bail you out. I won't treat you badly. Dean put away the letter and smiled at him. I said that I will give you a big gift when my identity is restored. This gift will be sent to your hands soon. Old Foulin deeply looked at Dudian. Now we are on the same boat. If you have an accident, then my bail will be a cover. It will damage the reputation of the aristocracy. I hope you can take care of yourself. Dean knew what he was worried about. He smiled. It's getting late. I'll go back first. Then he opened the window and left. Old Foulin watched Dean leave. After a long time, he retracted his eyes and looked at the huge oil painting hanging on the opposite wall. There was an old man whose cheeks were similar to his own. I hope that I won't become the sinner of the Ryan family. He murmured and became silent. 6th day. Morning. Dean asked Barton to buy a newspaper and come back. The morning newspaper had been printed. Dean was sitting in the hotel in the town. He was eating breakfast while reading the newspaper. One of the more eye-catching columns was about the assassination of Hughie Wright. There were many suspects such as the military, alchemists, potions, and prisoners who had been tried by Hughie Wright in the last 6 months. After all, a deacon of the magistrate had too many contacts. There were too many people who wanted him dead. It was difficult to find a clue for a while. The main suspect, theft criminal Dean? Dean read the newspaper. Among the main suspects, he was impressively among them. He was not surprised. He faintly smiled and looked at the other parts of the newspaper. He soon found news about himself. Theft criminal Dean was released from prison last night after being bailed by the Ryan family. There was a touch of smile on Dean's face as he saw the news. There was some emotion in his heart. This was the charm of the aristocracy and money. Although the wanted order had been withdrawn, but after all it had been posted. Now they still pretended that nothing had happened. The ones who were fooled were the civilians. In the aristocratic era, the newspaper had always been the communication machine of the aristocracy. But for the civilians, the newspaper still had a very high credibility. Chapter 165. Thorned Flower Prison. Warden's Office. The door was suddenly pushed open, and the youth in black armor strode in. He threw the newspaper on the table and said angrily, "What's going on? Bail? I need an explanation." Inside the office, Jones was sitting in front of his desk, eating his breakfast of bacon bread while flipping through the newspaper. Facing the black-armored young man who suddenly barged in, he frowned slightly and said, "Watch your volume." The youth in black armor was indignant. "I've been searching day and night for the past few days and finally found this brat's whereabouts. He's in Yardtown, and you're telling me that he's been bailed out? I've been wanting to skin this brat alive for so many days, and now he's bailed out? What kind of joke is this? He's a fugitive." Jones looked up from the newspaper, glanced at him, and said, "Calm down first, I'll tell you." The young man in black armor saw his unhurried manner and gritted his teeth. He took a deep breath and said, "Speak, I want an explanation." Jones put the newspaper aside, took a sip of milk tea, and said calmly, "The newspaper clearly states that he was bailed out by an aristocrat. It shows his ability that he could find an aristocrat to bail him out. For us, it's actually a good thing. At least we can ignore the fact that he escaped from prison, and it won't be too shameful for our Thorn Flower prison." The young man in black armor was stunned, and then anger appeared on his face. "Just because of this? He's a fugitive," Jones said indifferently, putting aside his identity as a wanted criminal. "He's just a thief, and a criminal who was sent to prison because of a noble's scheme. Now that a noble is standing up for him, it's not surprising that he's bailed out. As for the fact that he's a wanted criminal, it'll be treated as misinformation. Just find someone to take the blame. It won't damage the reputation of our prison, and it'll put an end to this matter." Black Armored Green's expression changed. "But isn't it too easy for him to be bailed out just like that?" Jones glanced at him and sighed. "At the end of the day, you and I are just servants sandwiched between the nobles. Even if we are unhappy, what can we do? If the nobles come forward and guarantee his release with their reputation, Who can stop them? Even the other nobles can't stop them. Unless he commits another crime, and there is conclusive evidence, and it is witnessed by all, only then can he be arrested and thrown into prison again. However, as long as he has the backing of a noble, there is still a chance for him to be bailed out. This is the rule. The black-armored young man was stunned speechless. Jones laughed and said calmly, "Although the magistrate claims to be impartial and have killed many nobles, behind the fall of those nobles, it was the other nobles who worked together to push for the fall of those nobles. The magistrate claims to be able to ignore the nobles and deal with anyone fairly. But in the end, the lifeblood of this world is in the hands of the nobles. Most of the economy and power are in the hands of the nobles. Neither the Holy Church nor the magistrate can ignore the deep-rooted prestige and credibility of the nobles. Just like this bail. If it's an ordinary rich businessman, how can he be bailed out? At most he can bail out a few thieves, who would dare to interfere with the criminals in our Thornflower prison. But the nobles are different. Even the most declining nobles have such rights as long as they are still nobles. This is called class sharing." The youth in black armor was silent. After a while, he suddenly said, "Even if he's bailed out, this kid won't live for long." Jones looked at him, gently smiled and said, "Yes, killing a deacon of the magistrate has angered the magistrate. Even if he's sheltered by the nobles, the magistrate can deal with him. After all, there are too many nobles who want to please the magistrate. Maybe the nobles who bailed out the kid will also be eradicated." The youth in black armor let out a sigh. There was a sneer on his face. "When he's executed, I'll go to the scene to see it in person." Jones smiled and said, "It's just a little thing. There's no need to be too angry." Commercial District. Erdos Mountain. Burong family. The huge castle was located on the hillside. The walls were built at the foot of the mountain. The mountain was surrounded by moats and drawbridges. There were many knights and squires patrolling the walls. Rudolf Burong got up in the morning. He didn't go downstairs. Instead, he called a servant to wash up and bring breakfast to his room. He also brought the morning newspaper. This kid. Rudolf noticed Huey's assassination as soon as he saw the newspaper. His eyes narrowed. He was almost convinced that Dudian was the one who had done the assassination. Rudolf was almost certain that Dudian was the one who had done it. Thornflower Prison is also a bunch of useless people. The military's ability to handle matters is getting worse. Rudolph's eyes swept to the main suspects under the newspaper. He saw Dean's name. His eyebrows slightly stretched out. The magistrate is useful. He glanced at it for a while and then stopped paying attention to it. He flipped through the other news. A moment later, he suddenly saw the name that he was sensitive to in the bottom left corner of the newspaper. Released on bail? He was startled for a moment. His face was covered with a haze. Ryan family, what a fat courage! He put the newspaper on the table and waved to the maid next to him. "Destroy all the newspapers you bought today. Don't let Miss see them. In addition, don't let her go out today. Stay at home." The young maid respectfully replied, "Yes." Rudolph was about to withdraw when he called out, "Wait a minute. She has been working with Gionda on a case. Go and call Gionda. Bring the case information and accompany Miss to study at home." "Yes." The maid respectfully nodded. Rudolph's eyes flashed as he looked at the newspaper on the table. He thought for a moment and said to the maid on the right, "Go and call the butler." "Yes." The maid respectfully replied. After a moment, a middle-aged butler dressed like a gentleman came in front of Rudolph and respectfully said, "Good morning, master." Rudolph indifferently said, "Go and call that old bastard." The middle-aged butler was surprised for a moment. He noticed the newspaper in Rudolph's hand. He immediately turned and left. Yardtown. Dean had eaten breakfast. He was surrounded by a team of knights of the magistrate as he came out of the hotel. "We suspect that you are involved in a murder case. Please come with us." a young knight of the magistrate said to Dudian in an indifferent tone. Chapter 166. Humph! A knight with sharp eyebrows snorted. You want to take the carriage? You killed Deacon Huey. You will be in jail. Dean slightly raised his eyebrows and looked at him with interest. When did a knight of the magistrate take the position of a magistrate? The case hasn't been interrogated yet, but the suspect is regarded as a criminal. Is this how the magistrate solves cases? If I remember correctly, the third rule of the knight of the magistrate is to investigate seriously and be unyielding. If I may ask, does slandering others without any evidence conform to the definition of seriousness and integrity? The knight of the magistrate wanted to say something but was stopped by the knight of the magistrate. Mr. Dean, please cooperate with us. Otherwise, we will have to arrest you by force. The knight of the magistrate said. Dean smiled. I'm very cooperative, but there is no conclusive evidence. I'm a normal civilian, and also a probationary magistrate. But now someone is wantonly slandering me. I need an explanation. You. The knight of the magistrate was angry. The young knight quickly stopped him and shouted, Don't forget the judgment armor on your body. The knight of the magistrate's face changed and lowered his head. Mr. Dean, it's his first time to perform a task. Please don't be offended. The knight of the magistrate pointed to the carriage not far away. Please cooperate with us. Dean faintly smiled and moved to the side. He patted the knight of the magistrate's armor. It's a good thing to hate evil, but it's best to polish your eyes. Don't blindly bite people. Your duty is to eradicate evil and protect civilians. Don't rely on your identity to bully civilians. Do you understand? The knight of the magistrate clenched his fists and looked at him angrily, but didn't speak again. Dean ignored his eyes and looked back at Barton and the other two. You wait here for me to come back. If you encounter any trouble, go to the Ryan Castle and find old Patriarch Feline. Tell him that you are my friend and he will protect you. Dean, you. Barton wanted to say something but stopped. Dean smiled. Don't worry about me. I'll come back after a cup of tea. He looked at the knight of the magistrate. Let's go. The young knight looked at him and waved to the people behind him. Let's go. A group of people surrounded Dean and left. The pedestrians on the street stopped to look at them. Wherever there was a knight of the magistrate, there would be a vicious criminal. However, what surprised them was that the person they arrested was actually such a young teenager. Dean sat in a carriage that had been transformed into a prison carriage. He was escorted by a knight of the magistrate to the magistrate of Tara district. Their street was much livelier than before. The neighboring magistrates also sent their priests to supervise the trial. Several streets were crowded with people, and many knights in judges' armor escorted the priests into the magistrate's court. Apart from the members of the magistrate, many commoners and wealthy merchants who lived nearby also gathered to watch this grand event. A carriage came slowly. It was escorted by a team of knights of the magistrate. It squeezed through the crowd and stopped in front of the magistrate. The young knight dismounted from his horse and went forward to open the iron chain outside the carriage. Mr. Dean, please. Dean tidied up his clothes and slowly got down from the carriage. He looked around and saw carriages with the flags of the magistrate. Dean smiled and followed the young knight down the stairs to the magistrate. Please. The young knight of the magistrate led the way. Dean followed him through the solemn vestibule into a dimly lit hall in the back of the hall. There were 4 people sitting in the hall. They were dressed differently and had handcuffed bracelets on their hands. They were sitting on one side of the long table. Some of them had gloomy expression as if they were thinking about something. Please cooperate. The young knight of the magistrate took out the handcuffs and said to Dean. Dean smiled and handed out both of his hands. The young knight of the magistrate said after handcuffing the bracelets, Sit down. They are suspects in the murder case just like you. 3 of them were men and 1 of them was a woman. One of them was dressed extravagantly. He laughed. The magistrate is really good. They can catch a person who hasn't even grown his hair yet as a suspect. Is it because they can't find the murderer that they want to catch a few innocent and pitiful people to be the scapegoats? The young knight of the magistrate's face sank. Shut up! The young knight laughed. Shut up! I'll keep my mouth shut. You. The young knight's eyes widened. Ha ha! A chuckle sounded from outside. 3 priests wearing white robes with golden embroidery came in. They were led by an old man with a kind face. He smiled and patted the young knight's shoulder. You go out first. The young knight of the magistrate saw the old man and his anger subsided. Yes. He turned and left. The old man pulled out a chair and sat opposite to Dean and the young knight of the magistrate. He smiled. You should be very clear about the reason why you are here. Deacon Huey of the magistrate has been assassinated. The 5 of you are the most likely suspects according to the information collected. The young man smiled and said, What do you mean by Huey Wright? I have never seen him. I have read the newspaper. When he died, I was having a party with my friends. How could I have time to assassinate him? The people who were present at the time can testify for me. The old man smiled and said, Don't worry, although you have an alibi, but according to our investigation, Deacon Huey lost money in gambling 3 months ago. He borrowed money from you and hasn't returned it. The amount of money is not small. It is enough to anger a person and make him pay to kill you. The young man's expression changed. He slapped the table and said, Don't talk nonsense. Although the amount of money is quite a lot, I wouldn't go so far as to kill a deacon of the magistrate for a bit of money. Only a madman would do that. The old man indifferently smiled. Didn't you say that you haven't seen him? The young knight's face was burning as if he had been slapped. Chapter 167. The old man smiled as he saw that all of them were silent. All of you are related to Deacon Huey. According to our investigation, you are the most likely to want to kill Deacon Huey. Suddenly he called out a name. A dark-skinned youth next to Dean shivered. I didn't kill him. I really didn't. The old man looked at him. You don't have a wife or a daughter. Why did you go to the flower shop to buy roses on the night of the 25th? Duddian looked down at the table in front of him. The young man named Boutte trembled slightly and said, I speak. The old man suddenly shouted. Dean and the others were shocked. Boo shivered. I wanted to buy flowers. I wanted to buy flowers for a girl I like. I have a crush on her. The old man narrowed his eyes. What is the girl's name? Lucy, Butte said in a low voice. The old man nodded slightly and waved his hand at a guard behind him, asking him to go out and investigate. The old man didn't continue to ask questions after the guard went out. He looked at a middle-aged man who was also wearing a white robe. Do a blood test. The middle-aged man nodded slightly and placed the box on the table. He opened the box and saw a bloody steel nail inside. He waved his hand to a nearby guard. The guard immediately handed over a bowl and a knife that had been prepared in advance. If you have read the newspaper, then you should know that this is the main weapon that killed Deacon Huey. The old man's eyes quietly swept over the faces of the 5 people. But there is another kind of blood in addition to Deacon Huey's blood. This blood is likely to be left by the criminal. His eyes fell on Duddian. Dean saw his expression and raised his eyebrows. Are you suspecting me? At present, the most suspicious person is you. The old man's face didn't have the previous gentleness. Instead, he showed a bit of hatred and sneer. 3 years ago you committed theft and was imprisoned. This case was personally handled by Deacon Huey. Later, you escaped from Thornflower Prison. These steel nails were the torture tools in Thornflower Prison. You resented Deacon Huey's sentence. After you escaped from prison, you used these tools to stab Deacon Huey. This is a shameful revenge murder. Hearing his words, the 4 people next to Dean were stunned. They looked incredulously at Dean, who was sitting side by side with them. Among them, the most shocked was the young man who spoke before. He saw that Dean was young and dressed in plain clothes. He thought that Dean was an ordinary civilian. He did not expect that he was a super criminal who escaped from the vicious Thornflower prison. Thinking of what he said before, his eyelids twitched, and he subconsciously moved to the left. Dean calmly looked into the old man's eyes. I was in prison when Deacon Huey died. I don't understand what you are talking about. Humph. Boy, don't play dumb. The middle-aged man next to him said in a stern voice, Do you really think that everyone in Thornflower Prison is a group of idiots? Now that the evidence is conclusive, do you think you can fool us? Now you should pray for the aristocrat who bailed you out. After the test is over, he will be listed as an accomplice. His family will be confiscated and his aristocratic status will be abolished. Dean stared at him coldly. Before the results are verified, I hope you can shut your mouth. The magistrate relies on evidence, not mouth. Or did you receive money from someone to find a scapegoat? Bastard, what did you say? The middle-aged man angrily pointed at Dean. Dean leaned back on the chair and looked at the old man in front of him. Since you have the evidence, there is no need to talk nonsense. Start the verification so that everyone can have some peace of mind. The old man coldly said, You don't need to say much. We will verify it. He said to the middle-aged man, Start. The middle-aged man coldly looked at Dean. Boy, the first one is you. Stretch out your hand. Dean stretched out his hand. The middle-aged man saw that Dean suddenly became honest. He coldly snorted and lifted Dean's sleeves. Suddenly, he saw the dense whip marks and other scars on Dean's arm. He could even see the marks left by the fire. He could not help but slightly change his face. The four people next to him also noticed the scars on Dean's hand. They could not help but take a deep breath. The countless scars made their scalp tingle. You deserve it. The middle-aged man snorted. He cut a shallow mark on Dean's wrist with a knife. Blood seeped out and slipped into the small bowl. The young man next to him secretly glanced at Dean. He saw that Dean's expression was as usual. He didn't even frown. He secretly sighed in his heart. At the same time, he said to the middle-aged man, Elder, do you want to scrape the blood off the steel nail to see if it can merge with our blood? The middle-aged man glanced at him and said in a cold voice, If the investigation didn't say that you have a motive to kill with your IQ, I don't believe that you can commit murder. The young man stared at him and said, What do you mean? The middle-aged man didn't pay attention to him and waved to the outside. After a moment, a knight came in with a palm-sized box. He put the box on the table and retreated. The middle-aged man opened the box. There was a soft little insect lying inside. Its whole body was crystal clear. It was chubby and twisted slightly on the soft cotton pad inside the box. This is a homologous insect. The middle-aged man looked at Dean and smiled coldly. The blood left on the steel nail has dried up. It can't be tested. But homologous insects can recognize the same blood. In addition to blood, they can also recognize other similar substances. Then he handed the small bowl to the box. The blood floating in the bowl exuded a faint smell of blood, and it quickly attracted the attention of the white and tender worm in the box. It crawled out of the box, and its many tiny crystal claws firmly grasped the smooth bowl. It stuck its head into the bowl and sucked the blood. After the blood entered its body became red. The middle-aged man handed the bloody steel nail to the front of the insect. He looked at it nervously and expectantly. The white and tender insect stood up and gently sniffed the steel nail. After a moment, it suddenly retracted its body and drilled into the box. Seeing this scene, the middle-aged man was stunned. The old man sitting opposite to Dean also changed his face. Try again. The middle-aged man reacted and once again handed the steel nail. The white and tender insect didn't respond. It was lazily lying in the box and twisting its body. Seeing this, the middle-aged man and the old man could not help but look at Dean. There were some doubts in their eyes. Although they had gathered 5 suspects, but the person they suspected the most was Dean. The blood on the steel nail was excellent evidence. However, now after verification, in addition to Hughie's blood, the other one was not Dean's. Besides him, who else could it be? Chapter 168. Dean looked at the worm. If I was the murderer, I believe that I wouldn't be stupid enough to assassinate a deacon of the magistrate with a steel nail. Such an obvious sign. I think that someone who knows the inside story has ulterior motives to frame me. After all, it's rare to kill someone with a steel nail. The old man and the middle-aged man looked at each other. They naturally knew that the inside story referred to Dean's prison escape. Although the nobles had come forward to suppress the matter, but they knew that Dean had indeed escaped from prison and the evidence was conclusive. However, since the matter was covered up, they were not willing to go deep into it. The main purpose of this investigation was to find the murderer who assassinated Deacon Hughie. From the current blood test it seemed that it wasn't Dean's doing. "Don't talk nonsense," the middle-aged man shouted. "Be honest. Did you use this nail to kill other people before you assassinated Deacon Hughie?" Dean smiled. "I'm really wronged. Although I have a grudge with Deacon Hughie, but I won't do such a crazy thing. I've just been bailed out. I don't want to provoke any trouble." The middle-aged man carefully stared at him. After a moment, he exchanged glances with the old man. The old man waved his hand. "Test the blood of others." The middle-aged man nodded slightly and immediately collected the blood of other people according to the previous method. It will take 12 hours for the homologous insects to be willing to eat different kinds of blood after eating. You will temporarily put them in prison and wait for the results to come out before leaving. The middle-aged man indifferently said. The four people looked at each other. The youth couldn't help but say, "How can this be? I'm just a suspect. How can you restrict my freedom?" "Don't be long-winded," the middle-aged man shouted. The youth's face changed. He gritted his teeth but didn't say anything. Dean looked at the old man. "I have been verified. Can I go now?" The old man looked at him and meaningfully said, "Remember your current bail status. If there are new results, please cooperate with us. Otherwise you will be arrested as a fugitive." Dudian nodded. "Of course, I also hope that you can catch the murderer as soon as possible. I also want to see whether it is a coincidence or someone is trying to frame me." The old man nodded slightly and said to the middle-aged man beside him, "This case doesn't seem to be the work of an ordinary person. Later, apply to the headquarters to send punishers over to investigate." The middle-aged man's expression turned serious as he nodded and said, "I understand." The other four were brought to a special interrogation room. The old man said to the middle-aged man, "Go and investigate the recent deaths. See if the blood on the bodies of the deceased is the same as the blood on the nails." The middle-aged man's eyes lit up and he immediately agreed. Dean had to hire a carriage to return to Yardtown as there was no knight of the magistrate to escort him. Barton and others were surprised to see Dean return safely. They came forward and asked questions. Dean told the three of them to feel relieved. Then he sat in the carriage and went to the Ryan Castle. This time, it was an open and above-board visit. He entered through the main gate, and after being notified by the guard at the gate, he entered the Ryan Castle. Old Foulin was sitting in the hall. There was a trace of surprise in his eyes as he saw Dean being led by the guards. But his face was full of smiles as he came forward. "Welcome! What a rare guest! It has been many years since a hunter has come to visit our Ryan Castle. Please sit down." There was a young man and a girl in the hall. They were wearing brightly colored clothes. They should be the grandchildren of old Foulin. Both of them were happy as they heard Dean's words. They knew what it meant to be a hunter. It meant a lot of wealth and money. "Hello, my name is Houghton." The youth came forward and shook hands with Dean. Dean shook hands with him and smiled. "You are welcome. I'm here to talk about cooperation with old Patriarch Foulin." Cooperation? Houghton was surprised as he heard the word. Although the Ryan family belonged to the Mellon Consortium, but there were many nobles under the Mellon Consortium. The commission was distributed according to the proportion of shares. Every time the resources were brought back from outside the giant wall, the Holy Church would get a fixed commission. The rest would be taken by the Mel family and the Borong family. The remaining small part would be distributed to the small families like the Mel family and the Borong family. In the entire Mellon consortium, the Ryan family belonged to the bottom few. Therefore, the money allocated to them was almost negligible. Unless the consortium's hunters had a big harvest outside the giant wall, they wouldn't be able to make a profit. However, if it was a hunter who worked for their family, then the resources from outside the giant wall would belong to the hunter and the Holy Church. The rest would belong to the hunter's family. Although a single hunter couldn't support a noble, but for the Ryan family, it could improve the living conditions of the family a lot. Over the years, they could slowly accumulate wealth. "Mr. Hunter, you are so young." The girl next to him looked at Dean in surprise. Hugh quickly shouted, "Don't talk nonsense." The girl stuck out her tongue and shrank back behind him. Old Fuline faintly smiled and said to Dean, "Mr. Dean, please come with me." He beckoned the middle-aged maid to support him. He used crutches to lead the way. Dean followed him upstairs to his study room. Old Fuline ordered the middle-aged maid to withdraw and close the door after entering the room. There were only 2 people left in the room. Dean and Old Fuline's smile slightly disappeared. Old Fuline sat in his chair. He narrowed his eyes and looked at Dudian. "I was surprised that you were able to come back safely after being taken by magistrate for investigation." Dean faintly smiled as he pulled a chair and sat down. "They couldn't find any evidence, so naturally they let me go." Old Fuline narrowed his eyes. "Isn't the nail used to kill Huey the evidence? Didn't the magistrate find anything from it?" Dean looked at him with interest. "Do you mean the blood on the nail or the smell?" Old Fuline's eyes moved. "What do you mean?" Dudian smiled. "Do you also think that I used steel nails to assassinate Huey for revenge?" Old Fuline was startled. "Isn't it?" Dean smiled. "Let's not talk about it today. I'll come to you when I need your help. I'm here to talk about cooperation with you." Old Fuline's eyes slightly opened. "What cooperation?" Chapter 169. Create a new consortium? Old Fuline shook his head. "It's useless. Although our Ryan family is qualified to apply for the establishment of a consortium, but no one will be willing to join." Dudian said, "No, we don't need others to join for the time being. Only nobles and wealthy businessmen can apply for a consortium. The procedures for commoners and wealthy businessmen to apply are too cumbersome. Nobles are different. They only need to show their identity. After establishing a consortium, they can rent a separate passage outside the giant wall from the Holy Church. They can clean up their own area. This is what I told you before. It's a thank you gift." Old Fuline smiled. "Although I don't know where you heard about these things, but the amount of money needed to rent a passage to the outside of the giant wall is unimaginable. Even the Mel family and the Borong family need to form a partnership. Moreover, they need to attract other aristocrats and wealthy businessmen to join the consortium. Our small Ryan family is simply impossible to do so. I've said it before. Anything that can be solved with money isn't a problem." Dudian smiled. "You should apply for the consortium first. I'll give you a sum of money in a few days." "You?" Old Fuline was surprised. He looked at Dudian suspiciously. "Are you going to rob them?" Dudian smiled. "The money in this world depends on robbing." Old Fuline stared at him for a moment. "I hope you don't make too much noise. Our Ryan family is just a small boat. Can't withstand your tossing. Whether the boat will capsize or not depends on the operator's operation, not the size of the boat." Dudian smiled. "Has the Borong family looked for you in the past few days?" Old Fuline nodded. "Not long ago. It's all thanks to you that my face was drenched with saliva. Then it's to moisturize the skin. It's easy to say. As you wish, the Melon Consortium has decided to kick our Ryan family out of the consortium. They have a good relationship, so the Mel Consortium will certainly agree. I believe that we will be kicked out in a few days. Old Foulene sighed. Dean said, "That's good." Old Patriarch Riley smiled. "I'm just sad about the money. If we are kicked out, they will definitely find a way to do things in the dark. They will make our Ryan family lose all the resources we invested." Dudian shrugged. "Not much anyway." Old Foulene's mouth slightly twitched as he saw Old Foulene's indifferent appearance. "Now you and I are tied to the same boat. I hope we can cooperate happily." Dean looked at the sky and got up. "I should go back." Old Patriarch sighed. He suddenly thought of something. "What is the name of the consortium? Ryan Consortium?" Dean thought for a moment. "Let's call it New World Consortium." New World Consortium. Old Foulene murmured. Dudian left the Ryan castle and returned to the hotel in the town under the old patriarch's personal escort. The middle-aged hotel owner was vigilant when he saw Dudian. There was a hint of worry and alertness on his face. Apparently, he remembered Dudian's appearance when the knights came to look for him in the morning. "It's done." Dean went back to the room and said to Barton and the other two, "In the next days, you will live in the Ryan castle. Tell them that you are my friends and they will entertain you." Live in the aristocratic castle? Barton and the other two were stunned. Dean smiled. "I hope you can learn wisdom in life. You will have a hard time in the future. Although the wind and rain in front of us have been covered up, but once exposed we will be beyond redemption. Moreover, we will face more problems in the near future. You are our right-hand men. I hope you can be strong." Barton and the other two looked at each other. The joy in their hearts suddenly faded. Dean didn't conceal the assassination of Huey from them. They also knew what kind of amazing move Dean had made. Although they had expected that the future would be very rough when they followed Dean, but they didn't expect that they would fall into such a dangerous situation at the beginning. Although the past days were hard, but they were relatively comfortable. But now they could be destroyed at any time. "I know." Barton gently nodded. Joseph and Crone bowed their heads in silence. They felt the cold wind around them. Dean was satisfied as he saw that the three of them were aware of the sense of crisis. A wolf could be trained in a dangerous environment, but a dog could be trained in a comfortable environment. Dudian returned to the residential area alone after entrusting Barton and the other two to the Ryan family. These days he entrusted the Ryan family to inquire about the whereabouts of Jura and her husband. They were expelled from the house assigned to him by the consortium and repatriated to the residential area after he was imprisoned. Fortunately, the house in the residential area hadn't been sold yet. Otherwise they would be homeless after being repatriated. Dean's heart was full of guilt as he sat in the carriage back to Lynn Street. He hurried to get off the carriage. He saw that the original house of Jura and her husband had been cleaned up. There were no fallen leaves on the grass. It was still early, so he could smell the smell of Jura and Gray in the house. However, Jura's smell was stronger than Gray's. She should be at home. In addition to Jura's smell, Dean also smelled a strange smell that was mixed with Jura's. He couldn't help but stare blankly for a moment. Seeing that there was no one around, he immediately jumped over the guardrail and arrived in front of a window next to the house. Through the gap of the window, he suddenly saw the scene in the room. It was still the same as before. Jura was sitting in front of a desk, wearing glasses and reviewing information. Next to her was a 7 or 8-year-old boy. He wrapped his wrist around her arm and gently rubbed against it. But he was very obedient and didn't make a sound. Jura smiled as she stopped from time to stroke the little boy's head. Dean was slightly startled, and suddenly felt a little sour in his heart. He was silent for a moment, slowly turned around, stepped on the lawn, climbed over the guardrail, and left the street. Dean stopped after walking for a long time. He looked up and saw the hidden alchemist's stronghold in front of him. 3 years had passed, but the alley was still as dirty and dark as before. The walls were still camouflaged with cloth. However, Dean could smell that there was no smell in the alchemist's stronghold. Most likely the stronghold had been moved. At this moment a carriage passed by. The breeze blew the curtain of the carriage, and a faint fragrance floated out. Chapter 170. Is it her? Dean's eyes flashed as he recalled the smell from the carriage. After a moment, he moved towards the direction of the smell. An hour later, Dean followed the traces left by the smell and came to a nearby town. The streets here were relatively dirty. Some dark alleys along the way were filled with rats. There were few people in the shops on both sides of the street. Dean stopped in front of a huge manor on the edge of the town. He saw the carriage that had passed behind him was parked in the corner of the manor. Nearby the carriage, there were 7 or 8 other carriages. Judging from the shape, they were not professional carriages used on the street, but privately built vehicles. The fabric and the size of the structure were different. Dean stood in the corner and looked at the manor. He soon noticed that the lawn of the manor was extremely clean. There were 4 guards at the door. Behind the other walls of the manor, there was a fixed smell floating back and forth along a fixed route. It should be the patrolling guards of the manor. Dean carefully looked at it and thought, sure enough, it is her. He walked around the town and soon found a tailor's shop. He went inside and said to the boss, "Make me a robe. I want it now." The boss was a curly-haired woman. When she saw a guest come in, she warmly greeted him and said, "Please sit down. The robe is very convenient. It will be ready soon." Dean nodded. He looked around the shop and suddenly smelled a faint fishy smell. He looked at the direction of the smell. It came from the wall behind the tailor's shop. It was extremely hidden. He could not help but be startled. He looked at the curly-haired woman unconsciously. The curly-haired woman turned around and asked, "What color do you want?" Dean's eyes slightly moved. "Black. Linen will do." "Good." The curly-haired woman turned around and picked out a piece of black cloth. She took out a pair of scissors to cut it. In this era, mechanical energy had not yet been used. Naturally, the sewing machine had not been invented. Dean silently looked at the back of the curly-haired woman. Suddenly, he found that the color of her nails was light red, and there were some residue in the gap. With his eyesight, although they were separated by a few meters, he could clearly see that these residue were minced meat. Is it a murderer? Or an alchemist of the Life faction? Dean was shocked. He didn't expect to encounter such a thing in a tailor's shop in this small town. Thinking of the many carriages parked in front of the manor, he faintly felt that he had entered an incredible alchemy stronghold. After a moment, the curly-haired woman handed the black robe to Dean. "Please put it on and see if it fits." Dean didn't wear it but looked at it. Not bad. After paying, he picked up the black robe and left. As for the mask, although the shop sold it, he gave up on buying it. Otherwise, it would be too weird to wear a black robe and a mask. If the other party was also an alchemist, they would probably guess his identity and leave information about his face. Dean went to other shops in the town and bought ink, pens, plush dolls, masks, flowers and other things. He came to a small hotel and threw the plush doll to the side. He dipped the pen in ink and drew an alchemy tattoo on his chest. After a moment, the previous black cross tattoo was branded on his chest again. He asked the boss for some coal in the room and dried the ink on his chest. Then he crushed the flowers and smeared the juice on his chest. He pulled off the remaining petals and threw them into the inner layer of his underwear. Finally, he left the hotel with the black robe and mask. Back to the manor, Dean took advantage of the fact that no one was paying attention to him and put on the black robe and the white cat mask he bought. Then he walked towards the manor. "Who are you?" 4 guards noticed Dean and stopped him when he came close. Dean said, "Get out of the way." When the 4 guards heard the unyielding voice behind the white cat mask, they looked at each other. One of the guards retracted the coldness on his face and said in a low voice, "Do you have an invitation?" Dean frowned and thought for a moment. "I didn't bring it." "You didn't bring it?" The 4 guards were surprised and their faces turned cold. Please leave. This is private property. No one is allowed to enter without an invitation. Dean replied, I'm looking for a friend. I'll have to trouble you to notify her. She just came over. Her name is Nightingale. She brought an invitation card with her. She can prove my identity. The 4 guards looked at each other. One of them shook his head. No, we are not responsible for passing messages. Dean's voice was cold. Don't fail to appreciate favors. You won't be able to bear the responsibility if today's event is delayed. The guard frowned and sneered. Don't talk nonsense. It's just a private gathering of my master's friends. It's not a big deal. If you are long-winded, we can only use tough means to ask you to leave. Dean didn't think that the guard would be so difficult to deal with. He could only say, Really? How many stars does your master have? Even a mere guard is so important? His words were filled with anger, as if he had blurted it out in a fit of rage. The 4 guards' faces changed. The first guard carefully looked at Dudian. Did you say that you are looking for Nightingale? I'll go in and help you ask if there is such a person. If there isn't, then don't blame us for being impolite. Dean snorted. Tell her that she is an old friend from 3 years ago. Hound is looking for her. Hound? Hearing this nickname, the 4 guards looked at Dean's face slightly relaxed. The guard immediately turned and ran into the manor. 10 minutes later, the guard returned. His attitude became polite. Please wait a moment. I'll help you inform her. She will be ready soon. Dean stood quietly with his hands clasped behind his back. After a moment, the gate of the manor was opened. A tall figure wearing an owl mask came out. She was wearing a bright dress. It seemed that she was going to a common masked party. After a moment, Nightingale came to the door. She looked at the figure wearing a white cat mask. There was some doubt in her heart. Are you Hound? Dean heard the beautiful voice. Although there were some changes compared to 3 years ago, it was more clean and mature, but it was still the same familiar timbre. He knew that his nose was not mistaken. He immediately said, Mouse, Viper, Nightingale, Hound. He successively said 4 code names. Nightingale was slightly startled. She pondered for a moment and said, Can you let me see your tattoo? Dean nodded slightly. The guard next to him opened the door. Dean lifted his black robe to reveal the black cross tattoo on his chest. Nightingale heaved a sigh of relief and said with a smile, I didn't expect it to be you. How did you find me? The 4 guards were relieved as they saw that Dean's identity was confirmed. Dean said, I've been wandering in this town recently. I accidentally saw you today. Nightingale's owl mask revealed a pair of bright eyes. She looked at Dean. Unintentionally? I haven't seen you for 3 years. It's not easy to explain how you can recognize me. Dean's mind raced as he heard her teasing tone. He scratched his head. Well, in fact, I heard it from a friend, but I'm not sure if it's the same person. I took the risk to come here today and found out that it's really you. Nightingale was interested. Friend? Which friend? Tell me and I may know him. Dean smiled. My friend doesn't want others to know his name. He's afraid of causing trouble. So I hope you can forgive him. Chapter 171. Dean nodded slightly and followed her. Is this a new alchemy nest? Almost. Nightingale answered vaguely. She suddenly thought of something and asked, I almost forgot to ask. Are you an apprentice alchemist, or have you joined the Dark Church and become an official alchemist? Dean quickly thought about her words and truthfully said, I'm still a trainee. Nightingale let out an oh and suddenly changed the topic. Speaking of which, we haven't seen each other for nearly 4 years. You suddenly left and completely lost contact with me. Did you encounter any trouble? Dean nodded slightly. A little trouble, but it's over now. Nightingale smiled. It's okay. Do you have your own alchemy point now? Dean's eyes lit up. I have one. What's wrong? It's nothing. If you have time, I can take you to see the rats. Their gathering place is in this town, not far from here. If you have the need in the future, you can study with them, Nightingale said with a smile. Dean's heart moved. The mice aren't with you? Nightingale slightly shook her head. At this time, the two came to the door along the lawn. The guard at the door recognized Nightingale and opened the door for them. Come with me. There are many big people here. Try to keep quiet, Nightingale whispered. She led the way after entering the door. The hall was dimly lit, and the walls were not lit by oil lamps, but by diamond-shaped crystals. It was said that this was a crystallized body of a special kind of monster, and this kind of monster was also the main target of hunters, so it was extremely valuable. The furnishings in the hall were moved to the side so that they could return at any time. There were 4 attendants standing under a huge oil painting in the main hall. One of them saw Nightingale coming over and looked at Dean. One of the attendants asked, "Who is he?" "My assistant," Nightingale said. The attendant looked at Dean but didn't say anything. He turned around and pushed the wall next to him. There was a slight rumbling sound. The wall under the oil painting slowly split open and revealed a dark passage. Nightingale went in first. When it was Dean's turn, the attendant suddenly reached out and stopped him. "We need to eliminate your smell. Please close your eyes." Dean looked at Nightingale and slowly closed his eyes. He felt a fine powder falling from his body. The powder had a strong earthy smell, and it covered up his smell. "Go in," the attendant said. Dean opened his eyes and saw Nightingale waiting in front of him. He immediately followed her. After he entered, the passageway slowly closed and returned to the appearance of a wall. The surrounding light was dim, but Dean could see very clearly. He followed Nightingale along the curved passage. Soon, the light was much brighter. They came to a huge square surrounded by high rock walls. The dome was also made of soil, but it was embedded with shining crystals. There was a striking building in front of the square. It was as majestic as the magistrate, but it had a bit more gloomy atmosphere. "That's a branch of the Dark Church," Nightingale whispered. Dean couldn't help but look at it. He was shocked. He didn't expect that there was another world under the seemingly ordinary manner of a rich businessman. Such a huge underground structure was an extremely huge project, beyond his imagination. "Nightingale." At this time, a clear and bright voice echoed. Nightingale and Dean turned their heads and saw 2 figures coming from the square. One was a man and the other was a woman. The man was wearing a golden robe and a dog mask. The woman was wearing a dark red robe and a rose mask. Her eyes and cheeks were covered, but the lower half of her face and lips were exposed. It was very eye-catching and sexy. Golden Rose. Nightingale smiled as she saw the 2 of them. They came closer and looked at Dean. The golden-robed youth with the code name Golden laughed. "You brought a new friend? Why don't you introduce him to us?" Nightingale seemed to be a bit embarrassed, but still said, "This is a friend I've known for a long time. His name is Hound." "Hound?" The woman in the rose mask glanced at the golden armor beside her and said, "Golden armor, that's a suitable code name. Speaking of which, what does your friend do? Is he like you? Does he major in metal research?" Nightingale looked at Dudian. "I remember that you were studying the stone materials, right?" Dean nodded slightly. "I learn a little bit of everything. I don't have a major direction for the time being." "Learn everything?" The golden armor glanced at him and said, "It's not that I want to talk too much, but you have to major in one area to have a way out. The world of alchemy is vast and profound. If you learn everything, even if you study for 100 years, you might not be able to achieve much." Rose asked, "Have you got a 1-star status?" Dean shook his head. "No, I'm still in the apprentice stage." "Apprentice?" Golden and Rose were surprised. They looked at Nightingale. "Is he an apprentice?" Nightingale looked around and whispered, "Don't be so loud." Golden and Rose looked at each other. Rose couldn't help but say, "How can you bring an apprentice in? Even if he is your friend, you can't break the rules." Only those who have officially joined the church can come here. You should let him leave. Nightingale whispered, It's okay. I can bring an assistant. It's okay if he comes in as my assistant. Golden smiled slightly. You are really good. He is just an apprentice. What's the point of bringing him here? It's better to let him wait outside. It's okay since he is here. Nightingale looked at Dean and diverted the topic. Did you come here today to submit the experimental report? Yes. Golden patted his golden robe. They could see the outline of a square. He said, My experiment has made some progress. I hope it will pass the review. Me too. Rose sighed and said, I hope the direction of this research is right and I can pass the review. I still need 12 points to get a 1-star medal. The golden armor looked at Nightingale and said, What about you? Are you here to submit a report too? Speaking of which, your alloy method inspired me a lot. Have you made any new progress this time? Nightingale nodded. I have gained something. Then let's go together. Rose immediately said. Nightingale hesitated and looked at Dean. Would you like to wait for us here? Chapter 172. Nightingale nodded. Almost. But even if you don't have a complete alchemy result, as long as you can come up with a reasonable framework of alchemy conjecture, you can get basic alchemy points and alchemy certificate if you can pass the review. After all, apprentices can only learn so much. It is very difficult to find a new direction from all the alchemy theories that have already been opened up. Thus, as long as you can come up with some relatively open-minded or creative conjectures, you might be able to pass the review. Dean nodded slightly. He was afraid that it was not because of the limited knowledge of the apprentice, but because the dark church couldn't see the light of day. In the long confrontation, the consumption of the grassroots was far more than that of the Holy Church. The only way to maintain the number and scale of the dark church was to relax the requirements of the lower level. In the end, the lower level would always serve the higher level. Rose looked at Dean and said, Even if you put forward an alchemy conjecture, you need a complete alchemy process and a relatively complete alchemy formula. Otherwise, it can only be regarded as fantasy. Yes. Golden nodded in agreement. Dean thought for a moment and said to Nightingale, I have an alchemy conjecture. I will take this opportunity to apply to the dark church. Nightingale's eyes were a bit surprised. She smiled. It seems that you haven't given up on the pursuit of alchemy in the past few years. I would like to see it. I wish you success. Rose and Golden looked at each other. They wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, they held back and didn't say anything. After all, Nightingale was a friend of Nightingale. It would be rude to continue to question her. Immediately, the four of them went to the dark church behind the square. In front of this magnificent hall, there were 2 stone sculptures. They were very similar to the sculptures outside the Holy Church. There were 2 4-winged angel sculptures, one male and one female. Both had a handsome face. Their hands were folded in front of their chest, looking up at the sky as if they were praying for all sentient beings. The only difference was that the cheeks of these 2 angel sculptures were a bit less merciful. Instead, there was a bit more evil charm. Moreover, their wings and clothes were black. They were wrapped in chains and had a bit of a murderous aura. Dean knew from Roseyard's notes that these were the purgatory angels that served the king of destruction. The 4 of them walked up the stairs, passed by 2 purgatory angel statues that were over 10 meters tall, and entered the dark hall. The hall was very spacious. There was a huge sign on the left side of the hall. There were many white papers on it. Dean glanced at the white papers and saw that there were various alchemy materials, potion materials, alchemy team recruitment information, and so on. Nightingale stopped and looked back at Dean. You are an apprentice. According to the rules, you can't personally submit your conjecture to the Dark Church. You can only find your master or other official members of the Dark Church to help you. Dean was surprised but immediately understood. Other alchemists were different from him. Most of them had their own masters. The reason why they stepped on the path of alchemy was that they met their masters and learned some superficial alchemy knowledge under the guidance of their masters. Then please help me to submit it, Dudian said to Nightingale. Nightingale smiled and said, "Can you trust me? We are old friends. How can we trust each other?" Dean smiled. If it was an average person, then he wouldn't believe it. Taking someone else's alchemy experiment as one's own wasn't something that hadn't happened before. Even many masters and apprentices would have such a problem. After all, a great and successful alchemy experiment would give a terrifying amount of point. Nightingale smiled. "All right, leave it to me." She stretched out her hand from the black robe. It was a white and delicate little hand. Dean glanced at it and knew that the owner of the small hand was a pampered person. He rarely did things in person. There was no sign of heavy work done on the palm. "Do you have a pen and paper?" Dean asked. Nightingale, gold armor, and Rose were all stunned. Nightingale withdrew her hand and said in astonishment, "Don't tell me you want to write it now?" Dean coughed. "It's written in my mind. It won't take too long." "Really?" Although she heard Dean's words, Nightingale still looked at him suspiciously. Who would come to submit an alchemy conjecture without being prepared in advance? Like them, when they came to submit alchemy results, they would repeatedly write, repeatedly revise and check several times to confirm that there were no typos or omissions. Rose asked suspiciously, "Are you really ready?" "Don't tell me he said that because he wanted to see this place for himself?" Nightingale looked at Dean for a moment. "Can you really write it down?" Dean nodded slightly to show his affirmation. "All right." Nightingale thought for a moment. "We will submit it first. You can write it down on the side. There is a place there." Rose and Gold looked at each other but didn't say anything. Anyway, they wouldn't be the ones who would lose face. There was no need to offend others. They took Dean to a counter next to the hall. There were many potion materials and alchemy materials behind the counter. There was a door next to it. Every once in a while, someone would come out of the door. The people in front of the queue would enter through the door. Apparently, it was the place where the test would take place. "Nightingale, look, there is zirconium behind it. My God, it's so expensive." While waiting in line, they were also looking around. Gold noticed the corner of the counter in front of them, and exclaimed in a low voice. Nightingale looked over and sighed. "It's really expensive, but my alchemy table is too poor. Even if I buy it, there is no way to melt it." Dean looked over. This zirconium was a rare metal ore. It was the size of a fist and silver gray. At the moment, a small piece on the counter was priced at 12 gold coins. 1 gold coin was equivalent to 10,000 copper coins, which was equivalent to the annual income of most residential families. Zirconium metal. Dean's eyes flashed slightly. This thing had a very high corrosion resistance. If it was added to the hunter's armor, it could improve the quality of the armor by several times. It could be used to deal with some monsters that could spit corrosive acid mist. Suddenly, Rose pointed to a tall and handsome figure in the front of the queue. Judging from the figure, it was a young man. Different from the other people's robes, he was wearing clothes, which were exquisitely tailored silver-white clothes with gold embroidery. He was very eye-catching in the crowd. Chapter 173. Forbidden Alchemist's Family? Dean was surprised. He looked at the youth and noticed that there was a badge on the youth's shoulder. It was engraved with a red mushroom pattern. He couldn't help but be surprised. TSK, our luck is not bad this time. The people of the Blaze family are indeed extraordinary. They dress differently from us. I heard that there is an extremely powerful force behind the Blaze family to protect them. The golden armor at the side tiptoed to take a look. It covered its mouth with its hand and whispered, "It's really someone from the Blaze family. We can't compare to a family that can research the forbidden technique." Rose's eyes were full of brilliance as she looked at the back of the youth. Nightingale whispered, "I really hope to see the Inferno family's forbidden technique." Dean was curious as he heard their words. What is a forbidden technique? He didn't see these things in Roseyard's alchemy note. Even a 3-star alchemist couldn't get access to it? Nightingale lowered her voice and explained. Forbidden technique, as the literal meaning is that it is forbidden to use alchemy. Many great alchemists have been born in history. They have created some incredible alchemy abilities. Legend has it that they can destroy the world. Some can boil lakes, and some can turn the land into a desert. These alchemy techniques are classified as forbidden techniques by the Dark Church because of their great lethality. Research and use are prohibited. Once discovered, the Dark Church will investigate. Dean was startled. Can boil lakes? Is it quicklime and sodium? Turn the land into a desert? He had heard of this alchemist. The Ryan family had once provoked such an alchemist, which led to the family's fiefdom turning into flowing soil and declining ever since. The founder of the Inferno family created a forbidden technique called Inferno. It is said that it will explode when it meets fire. The power is so great that it can even raise a small town to the ground. The golden armor sighed emotionally and said, "Just thinking about such a forbidden technique makes my blood boil. Every time I want to give up, I can't help but persevere when I think about the existence of such a great forbidden technique." "Me too," Rose agreed with a sigh. Nightingale said, "As long as you create a forbidden technique, you will be awarded a lifetime medal. You can even participate in the discussion of the Dark Church. This is something that we can only hope for. Once a forbidden technique is created, it will be forbidden to use it. Nevertheless, the Dark Church will compensate in other ways. For example, the Inferno family created the flame explosion forbidden technique more than 200 years ago. The family is still in existence today. It is said that the headquarters of the family is located in the inner wall." Gold and Rose's eyes flashed as they heard the words inner wall. They were full of longing. Dean thought about the explosion pattern on the metal on the shoulder of the youth. He had some speculations in his heart. "Can I see what the forbidden technique is made of?" Nightingale shook her head and said, "No, the forbidden arts are all sealed in the secrets of the Holy See and are never leaked. Even the members of the forbidden arts family are forbidden to leak them. If they are found to have leaked them, even the creator of the forbidden arts will be severely punished." Dudian nodded and asked, "What if someone else accidentally created the same forbidden technique?" "That's easy." The golden armor, who was beside him, replied, "There have been a few such things in history. The Church will first investigate whether the repeated invention of the forbidden technique was a result of plagiarism. If not, they will give the second creator a corresponding amount of alchemy points as encouragement. However, there will be no other rewards or medals." Dean nodded but didn't say anything. After a while, the queue in front of them gradually came to an end and entered the door. Not long after, they came out again. Although they were wearing masks, from their movements, it could be seen that most of them were dejected and sighing nonstop. Some of them were holding the information they had brought and seemed to be deep in thought. Nightingale, Rose and Gold couldn't help but look back when the youth of the Inferno family came out. They looked at his back as he left. After a few more people, it was finally Dean's turn. "Go in," a man wearing a white mask indifferently said behind the counter. The four of them entered the door. Behind the door was a dark room. It looked like an old office. There were 3 or 4 desks scattered around the room. Several people wearing the same masks were sorting out the information. A slim figure wearing a devil mask was sitting behind the desk near the door. She was wearing a black silk skirt. Her snow-white arms were exposed. It was incompatible with the ugly devil mask on her face. "Sit down." "Who's first?" A pleasant voice came from behind the mask. Nightingale and the other 2 looked at each other. Rose said, "I'll go first." Rose handed out the information under her dark red robe. She respectfully put them in front of the Devil Mask Woman. The Devil Mask Woman opened the stack of information and quietly read it. Nightingale saw the opportunity and pulled Dean. She pointed to an empty table next to her and whispered, "Right over there." Dean felt her breath drifting out from behind the mask. He leaned back slightly and instinctively pulled away a little. He nodded and took the pen and paper from her hand. He went to the table next to him and tested the depth of the writing. When the ink penetrated the tip of the pen, he began to write. Using multiple layers to filter water, this method has already been used. The key lies in the filtering materials, and there is nothing new in your information. Charcoal and cotton have already been used, they are currently the best filtering materials. You haven't found any new ones, and you don't have the ability to synthesize them. I think you should take a look at the last 10 alchemy newspapers. After a while, the woman with the evil ghost mask raised her head and handed the information in her hand to Rose. Her tone was a little cold. Rose froze for a moment before taking her alchemy materials. She lowered her head, seeming somewhat lost. The golden armor patted her shoulder to show encouragement. At the same time, he handed out his own book and said, "This is mine." The malevolent masked woman took it and flipped through it. After a short moment, she shook her head and said, "Extracting plant gum to make a new synthetic material. Although your alchemy formula seems feasible, the formula is wrong. The combustion link isn't detailed enough, and the temperature comparison isn't written down. Moreover, the decomposition process should only be something you thought about in theory, but you didn't put it into action. The formula is flawed. In addition, this idea is not creative. Both of your ideas are too rigid. There is no sense of novelty." She threw the information back. The golden armor picked it up and put it back into his robe. Chapter 174. Dudien's mind was completely focused on the memories in his mind. Although he had memorized the basic alchemy symbols, but he had forgotten a lot of alchemy symbols after several years in prison. Most of the remaining ones were vague in his memory. The devil-masked woman saw that Dudien didn't respond, so she said to Nightingale, "What about you? Don't dilly-dally and waste time." Nightingale quickly handed out her alchemy information. The devil-masked woman took the information and quickly read it. Manganese and ferroalloy? The devil-masked woman's eyebrows slightly raised as her eyes swept left and right. She pondered for a bit and nodded. "Not bad. It's reasonable. Passed the preliminary examination." Nightingale's eyes lit up as she was pleasantly surprised. Gold and Rose, who were next to her, said in envy, "Congratulations." The devil-masked woman took the information and said, "Show me your alchemy medal." Nightingale was happy. She took out the oval triangular medal that was hidden in her black robe. The back of the medal was engraved with the word, Nightingale. The devil-masked woman looked at the name and said, "The basic alchemy points for the preliminary examination are 10 points. Do you have any problem with this?" "Yes." Nightingale nodded. She was naturally clear about this. "Someone come and enter this into the inventory." The devil-masked woman said to the other people who were sorting out the information. A purple-robed figure came over and took the information and Nightingale's identity. "Hey, are you done? I don't wait for people here." The devil-masked woman looked at Dudien, who was writing on the table behind Nightingale. Dean put away the pen and gently blew the ink on the 2 pieces of paper. Then he turned to the side of Nightingale and handed them to the table in front of the masked woman. "Sorry to keep you waiting." The devil-masked woman's eyebrows twitched. "Only 2." She picked up the 2 pieces of paper from the table and glanced from top to bottom. "The ink hasn't dried yet. Did you just write this?" Nightingale, who was standing to the side, hurriedly said, "I'm sorry, he's my assistant and he's just an apprentice. When he came to apply for admission, he forgot to prepare the alchemy materials, so he wrote it down at the last minute." The devil-masked woman snorted but didn't say anything. She continued to read the papers. "Yellow and red scales burning? Glass powder?" The woman quickly scanned the first piece of paper and glanced at Dudien. She continued to open the second piece of paper. It was still wet with ink, but there were very few alchemy formulas. Sulfur, wood powder, fire, saltpeter? She slowly swept her gaze downwards and was suddenly startled. Although she was wearing an ugly demon mask, Nightingale, Gold, and Rose still felt her pause. Dean looked at her closely. After a brief silence, the woman slowly looked at Dean. These are two alchemy techniques. Both are related to flames. Do you know anyone from the Inferno family? Dean's eyes flashed as he shook his head. I don't know. Really? The woman narrowed her eyes as she stared at Dean's mask for a moment. She retracted her gaze and said, The first alchemy is about the analysis of the basic melting point and ignition point of the material. It is relatively elementary. You can barely qualify as an official alchemist. The second alchemy is more special. We will keep it for the time being. We will give you the results after the confirmation. Dean thought about the words of Nightingale and others. He nodded to show that he understood. More special? Nightingale, Gold, and Rose caught the evaluation of the devil-masked woman's words. They were startled and looked at Dean in surprise. Alchemy that could be evaluated as special was either a wrong idea or had a special effect. No matter which one it was, it could be regarded as full marks in terms of creativity. Even if the theory was later speculated to be wrong, it could still inspire some people. So it had no small value. You need to submit your fingerprints, age, and the name that will symbolize you in the future when you join the Dark Church. The woman took out a form from the drawer and looked at Dean. Everyone's fingerprints are different. We have professionals who can distinguish the difference between everyone's fingerprint. Once registered, this will be your identity in the future. You won't be able to hide or be impersonated by others. I hope you can treat it with caution. Oh, Dean said. His heart was a little stunned. Previously, he was still thinking about how this world's information was blocked. There was no iris recognition and blood type entry. What if someone killed others and used other people's metals to impersonate them? He did not expect to master fingerprint recognition. Have you thought about your future title? If you haven't thought about it, I can give you some hints such as Black Bat, Night Crow, and so on. The woman held the pen as she looked up at Dean. Nightingale looked at Dean. Hound sounds good, but it's too common. Some people have already used it. Dean nodded. He looked at the woman's mask and suddenly thought that he had chosen the identity of an alchemist. It meant that he had fallen into the dark forces. As the Holy Church had said, he would become a devil. Once his identity was exposed, it would be like the darkness meeting the sun. He would be purified immediately. This was a road of no return. But he had chosen it. There was no way out. Even if there was a way out, he didn't want to retreat. A hound is a dog after all. Dean whispered. Since I'm a devil, why not become a devil among devils? My code name is Devil King. The woman, Nightingale, and others were startled. Devil King? Has anyone used this code name? Dean asked. The woman responded. Boy, your courage is not small. You dare to call yourself a Devil King. Dean indifferently said, Since I don't have the determination to become a Devil King, why bother to do these shameful things? Humph! The woman coldly snorted. Listening to your tone, it seems that you look down on your own identity. Aren't you proud of joining the Dark Church? Dean quietly looked at her. Knights are proud of their code, nobles are proud of their etiquette, rich businessmen are proud of their wealth, light is proud of their holiness, and I am proud of myself. Your own identity? You know what's good for you. The devil-masked woman's tone softened as she heard his words. Nightingale, Gold, and Rose were relieved. They were afraid that Dean would say something wrong. They didn't realize that when Dean said myself, he didn't mean the identity of joining the Dark Church, but himself in the real sense. I'll write down your name. I'll investigate it in 3 days to see if there are any people with the same name. If there aren't any, I'll engrave it on your medal. She then asked Dean's age and saved the fingerprints of Dean's 10 fingers. Chapter 175. Go and come back in 3 days. The woman put away the materials and asked the three of them to leave. Nightingale looked at Dean as they left the room. Her eyes behind the owl mask flashed. Congratulations! Your first application was approved. Now you are an official alchemist. Congratulations, said the golden armor beside him with a smile. Rose blinked and curiously asked, What kind of alchemy did you submit? How could it be called special? Dean smiled. It's just ordinary alchemy. Rose didn't ask again as she saw that Dean didn't want to say it. Nightingale looked at Dean. Are you free? I'll take you to see Mouse. If he knows that you have become an official alchemist, then he will be able to cure his laziness. Dean thought for a moment and shook his head. No, I have other things to do. Let's go another day. All right. Nightingale nodded. Nightingale and the others didn't leave immediately. They strolled in front of the shops around the square. Occasionally they would see rare alchemy materials that were hard to find outside. They would buy some. Dean accompanied them to stroll around. He noticed that there were not only alchemists in the Dark Church's branch. There was another extremely evil profession, potion master. If alchemists were equivalent to the scientists of the old era, then potion masters were a group of madmen who were interested in developing various poisons and potions. They were crazier than the alchemists of the Life faction. In the history of the giant wall of Sylvia, potion masters had slaughtered small towns and exterminated aristocrats. Their destructive power was extremely terrifying. Dean had read in Roseyard's notes that it was better to provoke the Holy Church than to offend a potion master. Otherwise you wouldn't know when you would die. Moreover, the fate of being poisoned by a potion master was extremely painful and miserable. Potion master. If I use the poison to hunt monsters outside the giant wall, then it would be a good weapon. Dean thought in his heart. At this time he saw Nightingale picking a small piece of nickel in front of the shop. After a while, they were almost done with their stroll and left together. Do you want me to give you a ride? Nightingale asked as she remembered that Dean didn't have a carriage. Dean shook his head. Thanks, but it's not on the way. Nightingale nodded slightly. In fact, she was just being polite. If Dean agreed, she would be in a difficult situation. From childhood to adulthood, she had never been alone with strangers except for her relatives and servants. Gold Armor and Rose also got into their carriages and left. Dean came to a dark corner of the town. After confirming that no one was following him, he took off his mask, put away his black robe, and quietly left the town. In a secret hall that few people knew about. In an office in the main hall, a few figures shrouded in darkness sat at their respective tables, busying themselves. Suddenly, a slight sound came from a metal pipe beside one of the tables. The people sitting at the table turned their heads to look, only to see a pitch-black triangular snake head slowly protruding from the metal pipe. Its forehead was covered with black scales, and one could tell at a glance that it was a venomous species. The figure at the table slowly stretched out his hand, as if he wanted to stroke the snake's head. The black snake slowly opened its mouth, and there was a black reel in its sharp fangs. The figure at the table pulled out the reel, opened it, and took out a letter and a roll of information. After a moment, he put away the information and the letter, and muttered to himself, "Flame explosion forbidden technique again? It seems that there are a lot of nobles who have been colluding with alchemists recently." He pondered for a moment, and immediately wrote a letter, stuffed it into the reel, and handed it to the black snake. The black snake opened its mouth, swallowed the reel, and slowly retracted its body back into the metal pipe. Mount Erdo's Burong family. In the castle surrounded by rivers of traps, there was a bamboo chute-like room in the castle. Two figures were sitting in front of a desk. There were a lot of information and several thick books on the table. According to our investigation, the murderer is likely to be his friend. The blonde Gionda sat by the desk and gently tapped a pen on a document. He said gently, "We'll start with him later." A pretty and slim figure was sitting at the opposite side of the table. She was wearing a simple but expensive light green dress. She was looking at the potted plants on the window next to her. When she heard Gionda's words, she looked at the direction he was pointing at. She was silent for a moment and suddenly asked, "Teacher, is there any trouble in our family?" Gionda was taken aback. She looked at the beautiful girl and said, "Why do you think so?" "Recently, my father has been deliberately preventing me from leaving the castle, and even troubled you to come to my house to accompany me. There must be something bad happening outside that my father doesn't want me to know." The girl looked up at him and said, "Can you tell me?" Gionda looked at her bright and clear eyes. His heart skipped a beat. He turned his head away and said, "It's your illusion. Your Bourong family is an ancient aristocratic family with a huge industry. How can you encounter trouble? But recently there are alchemists outside. It's not safe. So I'm afraid you will encounter danger." "Really?" The girl stared at him deeply, bowed her head and didn't say anything. Gionda put away the documents on the table. "That's all for today. I think you're a little tired. I've found some clues. I'll go back and send someone to investigate." Then he picked up the books and materials, turned around and left the room. In this room, which was comparable to an ordinary aristocratic hall, there was only the girl left. She sat silently for a moment and felt a little tired. She got up and went to the window. She looked at the courtyard and fruit trees outside. Her depressed mood eased a lot. Suddenly, she saw a carriage coming from a distant path. There was a bright dark red flag on the carriage. The girl's eyes lit up as she quickly greeted the carriage. The carriage soon stopped in front of the courtyard. A tall girl with white skin and dark red curly hair came down from the carriage. Her slender body seemed to be blown by the wind at any time. She ran out of the carriage and saw the girl in green skirt running out of the courtyard. She was surprised. "Jenny." Jenny's face was full of joy as she said, "Saya, why have you come?" "I'm bored to death, so I came to play with you." Sarah Mel smiled. "Great, let's go inside." Jenny pulled her friend back to her room. The sun was setting. The afternoon passed. Sarah was holding Jenny's favorite plush doll. She stood in front of the window and looked at the sky. "It's getting late. I should go back." Jenny said, "Why don't you rest in my house tonight?" Sarah Mel shook her head and said, "Today I'll go back and rest early. Tomorrow I have a place to go." "Ah, right, I came here to tell you good news." "Good news?" Jenny was surprised. Sarah Mel smiled and said, "You met a hunter who can write poetry. Wasn't he imprisoned? But recently he was released on bail. Tomorrow I will go to a party. Maybe I will meet him." Sarah Mel smiled and said, "That's right. Hunter." Jenny's body shook as she looked at her in disbelief. You are talking about Dean?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't remember his name. But this time he was bailed out. I think he will encounter a lot of trouble. The noble who bailed him out is too weak. He wants to set up a consortium. I think he wants to use your friend." Jenny was stunned and murmured, "Didn't my father say that he can't be bailed out for what he did?" Sarah was surprised. "Really? It's just theft. We used to do this kind of thing when we were children. With the power of your family, it should be easy to bail him out." Chapter 176. What's fair or not? As long as you are happy. Sarah Mel poked her head with her finger and said, "You are too honest. Like my father said, grab whatever you like. There is nothing in this world that can't be exchanged with money and power. Well, except for great artists like Master Tiza." Jenny sighed and slowly shook her head. Although she and Sarah Mel were childhood playmates and had similar interests in many aspects, there were some things that she still firmly believed in her own belief. "I'll go back first." Sarah didn't say much as she waved goodbye. Jenny nodded and suddenly thought of something. "Did you say that you might see him? Then, can you help me bring a letter to him?" Sarah Mel raised her hand and touched her face. She smiled and said, "This lady will not be a messenger. If you have something to say, then say it yourself. Weren't you very brave before?" Sarah Mel smiled and touched Sarah's face. After saying that, he blinked his eyes and turned to leave. Yard Town, Ryan Castle. A carriage entered the castle. The door was pushed open and Dean got off the carriage. He followed the servant into the castle. It was dusk. Smoke was floating behind the Ryan castle. Dinner was being prepared. In the hall of the castle, the servants stood respectfully on both sides. Although the Ryan family had declined, the etiquette of dining was still maintained. Old Fouline's children and grandchildren had arrived in the spacious dining hall. They were busy with their own things and occasionally chatting with each other. Houghton was talking to his sister when he saw Dean coming from outside. He quickly got up and greeted him. "Hello, Mr. Dean." Dean shook hands. "I came at the right time." Hugh laughed. "Yes, Mr. Dean hasn't eaten yet. How about we eat together?" Dean didn't refuse. "Then I'll have to trouble you to add a pair of chopsticks." "Chopsticks?" Hugh was surprised but didn't ask much. He smiled and nodded. He touched his nose and entered the dining room. Old Fouline was in the office on the second floor. Barton, Crone and Joseph were also in the dining room. They were sitting in a corner but no one paid attention to them. Seeing Dean enter the restaurant, the three were surprised and immediately greeted him. Dean smiled and nodded to the three. At this time, a middle-aged man with a white beard asked Hugh, "This is—" Houghton hurriedly introduced, "This is the hunter hired by Grandpa." "Hunter?" There was a trace of surprise in the middle-aged man's eyes. He stepped forward and shook hands. "Hello, I'm the second son of old Fouline, Jake." Dean gently shook hands. "Hello." The other people sitting in the restaurant also came forward to greet Dean. The third generation Houghton stood next to him. He was curious and wanted to come forward to greet Dean. However, he just nodded and called him Mr. Dean because of his status and etiquette. "Mr. Dean is so young. Which consortium did you come from?" Jake asked with a smile. "Mellon Consortium." "Mellon Consortium?" Jake was not surprised. "My father has recently founded a new consortium. It's called New World Consortium. It's really gratifying to be able to win over a young and promising hunter like you." Dean smiled. Although his face was full of joy, but when old Fouline founded the consortium, most of his children tried to stop him. Fortunately, although old Fouline was old, he was still able to control them. After a moment, old Fouline came to the dining hall. He was not surprised to see Dean. There was a touch of smile on his face. "Mr. Dean, you came really early. The hunter who came early gets the bird to eat." Dean got up and smiled. Old Fouline waved his hand to indicate everyone to sit down. He came to the patriarch's seat with the help of the middle-aged maid. "Mr. Dean, you sit next to me." Jake and the others were surprised. They didn't expect the patriarch to value Dean so much. Dean nodded slightly and sat down. Coincidentally, Jake was sitting in his seat. The smile on his face was a little stiff, but he still squeezed out a smile and moved back a seat. "Let's eat," old Fouline said to the middle-aged maid next to him. The middle-aged maid nodded and turned to another maid to pass the message. After a moment, the servants brought the dishes to the table. Old Fouline smiled at Dean. "I didn't know that Mr. Dean would come today. The dinner is a bit simple, so please enjoy. Save and get rich." Dean smiled back. The dinner table looked happy and harmonious. Old Fouline wiped his mouth with a handkerchief. "Mr. Dean, our Ryan family has established a new consortium. Tomorrow night will be the opening ceremony of the consortium. Many old acquaintances of the nobles will come to congratulate us. You are currently the only hunter in our consortium. I hope you can attend." Dean nodded. "No problem. Grandpa, can I go too?" Hugh shouted from the end of the table. Old Fouline looked at him. "You don't have enough seniority. You should put your mind on your studies. When you get the Knight's Certificate of Honor, you will bring glory to our family." Hugh's face was pale as he coldly snorted. After dinner, old Fouline called Dean into the study room to discuss some matters. The nobles who will be attending tomorrow are in a similar situation as the Ryan family. They are relatively declining. Old Foulin went straight to the point after the middle-aged maid left. Some of them want to participate due to etiquette. Some of them want to see the situation of our consortium. They want to join and share the benefits. In any case, this is the first time that our consortium will show up. I hope to leave a good impression. Dean nodded. They are not the only ones who will pay attention to this party. The entire aristocratic circle will be looking at us. Yes. Old Foulin deeply nodded as he saw that Dean understood. He secretly looked at the teenager. There have been many declining aristocrats who wanted to establish a consortium. They wanted to draw other declining aristocrats to join them. However, these declining aristocrats are scattered. They will be crushed by other consortia. Over time, there are very few declining aristocrats who are willing to establish a consortium. After all, the establishment fee of a consortium is not low. Now our Ryan family is desperate. The other families should have investigated very clearly. In any case, since we have taken this road, I hope to have a good start. Therefore, I intend to announce to the public that you are an intermediate hunter. In this way, we can improve the foundation of our consortium. Dean pondered for a moment and nodded. All right. In the future, we are likely to be suppressed by the Melon Consortium. Old Foulin sighed. It's all up to you. Our Ryan family can't afford to toss and turn. We can't stop this giant sword. Dean smiled. Once we accumulate enough funds to rent the passage outside the giant wall, our wealth will roll faster than a snowball. Old Foulin wryly smiled. Although he didn't know where Dean's confidence came from, but he couldn't refute anything. Now he could only pray. Are there alchemists behind some big aristocrats? Dean suddenly asked. Old Foulin was silent for a moment. Yes, the wealth created by an alchemist master is much more than that of a hunter. Chapter 177. Old Foulin looked at Dudian. You don't seem surprised. Dudian smiled. Why should I be surprised? Alchemists are evil and dark existences. Even the knights are loyal to the aristocracy. Isn't it surprising that they have dealings with these evil and dirty guys? Old Foulin looked at him. Dudian faintly smiled. Everyone has a dark side. I believe that even the Pope of Light has his own secret. So there is nothing to be surprised about. If there is no dirty means, then how can you live well? After all, the world's resources are limited. If you live well, then it means that there are people who live poorly. They will naturally try to take away your life. Old Foulin silently looked at him. Did you learn all this in prison? It's a very simple rule. Everyone knows it. There is nothing to learn. Dudian indifferently said, Do you know which aristocrats have alchemists working for them? Old Foulin looked at him and sighed. There are too many. Basically all the upper-class aristocrats have some relationship with the Dark Church or alchemist. The military is no exception. Do you know who the alchemists behind the Milan and Bourong families are? Dudian asked again. Old Foulin shook his head. I don't know about this. Communication between alchemists and families is extremely secretive. In addition to the patriarch's most trusted confidants, even the children of the family may not know about it, let alone outsiders. However, if you want to know more about it, you can find clues from various industries of the family. Alchemists help the aristocrats develop new products and sell them. If you can find someone who has joined the Dark Church, then you can trace the identity of the alchemist. Of course, it will cost a lot of gold coins. Dudian's eyes lit up. Does the Holy Church know about the secret communication between the aristocrats and the alchemists? They are not fools. Of course they know about it. Old Foulin sighed. Although the Holy Church is powerful and has a wide range of believers, but they still rely on the aristocrats. If the economic system of the aristocracy collapses, then the losses to the civilians will be greater. Then it will cause a series of chain reactions. In our circle, it is called a currency storm. Once it happens, it will even lead to riots in various regions. This is what the Holy Church doesn't want to see. Dudian knew that the currency storm was similar to the financial crisis of the old era. So the Holy Church is turning a blind eye. Not really. Old Fulin shook his head. If there is no conclusive evidence, then it will lead to a collective backlash from other aristocrats. That's why the Holy Church is afraid of the Holy Church. Although they know that most aristocrats have contacts with the alchemists, they have no way to trace it because they don't have any evidence in their hands. Even an ancient family like the Mel will be annihilated. Dudien's eyes narrowed. It seemed that he had underestimated the power of the Holy Church. Does your family have their own shop in the yard town? Dudien changed the topic. Old Fulin was surprised. Do you want to borrow it? Well, I'll borrow it for a period of time. I'll return it to you at the rental price. What are you going to do with it? Old Fulin looked at him suspiciously. Sell things. There was a touch of smile on Dean's face. I happen to know an alchemist. It can be regarded as a way to make money for our consortium. What do you think? Do you know an alchemist? Old Fulin's pupils shrank as he looked at him in surprise. How do you know him? Weren't you in prison before? This is my private matter. Don't ask about it, Dudien reminded. Old Fulin looked at him in bewilderment. He finally gave up and asked, What faction does this alchemist friend belong to? Dudien was a little surprised. He didn't expect the old man to know so much about alchemists. He belongs to the material faction. He gave me an alchemy recipe. Tomorrow I'll go and collect the materials to make it. I should be able to make a lot of money. Old Fulin was relieved. Nobles liked to deal with alchemists from the material faction. They didn't need to be polite to them like potioneers. They didn't need to be afraid of them like alchemists from the life faction. Is this the gift you gave me? Old Fulin sighed. I didn't expect you to have such a background. What is the level of this alchemist? Very high. Dudien replied briefly. Old Fulin didn't hear the difference in Dudien's words. Very high. If it is a 2-star or 3-star alchemist, then our Ryan family may be able to turn over a little. At least we won't be powerless in the face of suppression from other consortia. Dudien faintly smiled as he saw that old Fulin was still probing for specific information. It's getting late. I should go back. Old Fulin couldn't see any thoughts from Dudien's expression. His face didn't change when he heard about a 3-star alchemist. Even if he isn't a 3-star alchemist, he should be a 2-star alchemist. Old Fulin was happy as he thought of a plan. The next day, Dudien went to several nearby towns to buy yellow phosphorus, wood, red phosphorus, and other materials. He went to a more remote town and rented a small workshop with a gold coin. Then he moved the purchased materials to the workshop. In the process, Dudien thought that old Fulin would send someone to follow him. He didn't expect to smell anyone along the way. He immediately remembered that old Fulin was aware of his magic mark's ability through the Melon Consortium. So he didn't do anything in vain. It was afternoon when the materials were ready. Dudien thought of the consortium's opening party in the evening. He stopped what he was doing and prepared to go to the slave market tomorrow to hire a few workers to start the work. The night came quickly. After a whole day of decorating, the Ryan castle had become a lot livelier. The lamp oil on the walls had all been replaced with the more valuable white fat oil. The light was bright when it burned, and it didn't have any strange smell. It even had a faint fragrance. Chapter 178. An aristocratic carriage drove into Yardtown and passed by the front of the town's households. Such a grand scene surprised the townspeople. Ever since the Ryan family moved here and became their lord, they had never seen so many nobles come to visit them. The carriages stopped in front of the Ryan castle. Old Fulin's butler personally stood at the door to greet the guests. Dean had come early in the afternoon to discuss matters with old Patriarch Fulin. At the moment, Both of them were standing in front of the window on the second floor of the castle. They were looking at the brightly lit manor. The carriages had flags of their respective families. Old Patriarch Fuline introduced the origin and background of each carriage to Dean. Dean benefited a lot from this. Almost everyone has arrived. Let's go down to entertain the guests. We can't be too rude as the host. Old Fuline said to Dudian. Dudian nodded. Both of them went downstairs and entered the decorated hall. Originally there were only 4 oil lamps in the hall, but now there were more than a dozen. It was as if it was daytime. Nobles dressed in bright clothes with extraordinary temperaments were chatting with their wives and children in the hall while enjoying snacks and fine wine. The aristocrats who were chatting enthusiastically turned their eyes to them as Dudian and Old Patriarch went downstairs. It was obvious that they had been paying attention to them for a long time. "Oh, Old Fuline, I haven't seen you for a few years, but you still look so energetic." A middle-aged aristocrat who was standing next to the stairs saw Old Fuline coming downstairs. He immediately raised his glass and smiled. Dudian glanced at him. Old Fuline had told him that the middle-aged man was from the Nikon family of the neighboring towns. They were also a declining small aristocratic family. Moreover, they were different from the Ryan family. Nikon family had been a small aristocratic family from the beginning to the end. They had been struggling to survive until now. Old Fuline gently smiled. "You're overpraising me. Are you used to drinking wine? If I had known that you have such good wine here, I would have come over earlier." The middle-aged man laughed. Old Fuline smiled. "You are welcome at any time in the future." At this time, other nobles also came to greet Old Fuline. There were a total of 8 aristocratic families. Most of the patriarchs had come in person. Only 2 families had sent their children to congratulate Old Fuline because their patriarchs were too old. Old Fuline was the same generation as them. As the old saying goes, a thin tiger is stronger than a wolf. A graceful lady said with a smile, "The Ryan family must want to make a big movement by establishing a consortium, right?" The others looked at Old Fuline with a smile. Old Fuline chuckled. "Since we are establishing a consortium, we naturally want to make a lot of money. Don't you want to?" The middle-aged man from the Nikon family asked with interest. "So, Old Patriarch, you have a good source of income?" Old Fuline smiled. "Let's talk about this later. The party is about to begin. Let's listen to the music first. I have specially invited the master of St. Peter's Music College to come and play." Seeing him change the topic, the others didn't continue to ask. They followed Old Fuline into the hall. They came to the seats in front of the music stage. "Who is this?" another fat middle-aged man asked as he looked at Dean, who was inseparable from Old Fuline. Old Fuline smiled. "This is our consortium's hunter, Mr. Dean." "Hunter?" The nobles who were sitting next to Old Fuline changed their faces. They subconsciously moved away from Dudian, but soon realized that it was rude. Moreover, it was useless. So they restored their original position. The fat middle-aged man squeezed out a smile. "I didn't expect that your consortium would be able to attract hunters so quickly. It's really a fierce momentum." Haha, Dean noticed the fear in the eyes of the nobles. But he looked calm. He knew from Old Fuline that the existence of hunters was extremely popular and hated by the nobles. They loved hunters because they could bring wealth. But they hated hunters because they were easily angered and dangerous. There were many cases in history where hunters were out of control and killed the nobles on the spot. Although the hunters were executed by the magistrate, but the dead nobles wouldn't be resurrected. So most of the nobles didn't want to get too close to hunters. Even if they needed to pass orders, they would often use letters. Occasionally they needed to talk face to face. They would secretly arrange knights to protect them so that they could be on guard against such a dangerous item. In the eyes of most of the nobles, they didn't see hunters as the same kind as the monsters outside the giant wall. The others knew Dean's identity, so they were a bit restrained. Dean felt familiar as he saw their smiles. He remembered the time when he attended the Melon Consortium's aristocratic party. He saw Glenn and a senior hunter from another consortium enter the hall. The nobles took the initiative to greet them. He was too young at that time, so he didn't notice the hidden fear in their smiles. But now he clearly felt it. The concert is about to begin. Old Foulin smiled. Dean looked at Old Foulin and saw the smile on his wrinkled face. He calmed down and quietly looked up to enjoy the music concert on the stage. There were more than 20 people in this music concert. The conductor of the concert understood Old Foulin's intention and slowly raised the baton in his hand. The music notes floated out and surrounded the hall. It was refreshing. Old Foulin's children, who were sitting at the back of the hall, and the nobles' children, were leisurely intoxicated by the music. Suddenly, the door of the hall was pushed open. A group of figures entered the hall. One of them sneered, "Old Patriarch Foulin is so impatient. The banquet hasn't started yet?" The flowing music came to an abrupt end. The seemingly peaceful atmosphere in the hall suddenly solidified. Everyone looked back and their faces slightly changed. The fat middle-aged man sitting next to Dean whispered, "Mel family? Milan family? How come they are here?" Dean recognized the identity of the person who came. It was a slim and elegant girl. Her cheeks were extremely beautiful, like a dream. Her clothes were exquisitely tailored and had a noble temperament. There was a young man standing next to her. He was wearing a gorgeous platinum costume. His posture was straight like a knight. He had an aristocratic fencing sword on his waist. Behind the two of them were 5 or 6 knights and 2 attendants. Chapter 179. Old Foulin's face was gloomy, but soon restored his calmness. He slowly stood up and said, "The guests have arrived. I don't know why the two of you have come here in the middle of the night. Does that mean we've come uninvited?" The handsome youth's mouth curled into a smile. "Is this how the Ryan family treats their guests?" Old Foulin coldly replied, "Is this how the Milan family treats its guests?" The handsome youth was slightly startled. The smile on his face disappeared. "I heard that your Ryan family has applied to establish a consortium. We have come to pay a special visit. If we have taken the liberty, please forgive us." Although his words were modest, his tone and expression were still stiff. There was even a hint of sarcasm in them. Old Foulin indifferently said, "After all, it's less than 100 years of history. I can understand that there isn't much etiquette inheritance." The handsome youth's face sank. He rolled his eyes and suddenly smiled. "Our Milan family's history can't be compared to your Ryan family's. But it's a pity that a giant tree grows old and flowers wither. Not every family can preserve their traditions and wealth." Old Foulin indifferently looked at him. "Today the sun will set and tomorrow the new sun will rise. But who knows whether the new sun will follow the footsteps of the old sun?" The handsome young man's face slightly changed. He was about to continue to speak, but the girl next to him smiled. "Is there a great banquet tonight? How can it be so sour? Patriarch, please forgive us if we offend you. We came here on behalf of our father to congratulate you. I wish your consortium a smooth sailing and a bright future." Old Foulin faintly smiled. "My 2 fathers are so busy, but they still remember to worry about us. It's really a trouble for them. After all, you used to be part of our Melon Consortium. We should remember you." The girl smiled. Old Foulin glanced at the knights behind them. "It seems that your father didn't teach you that it is forbidden to bring knights to the banquet." The handsome youth next to him narrowed his eyes and slightly sneered. "Of course we know this, but I heard that there is a hunter in this banquet. I think you know about it. What if you get bitten by a hunter when you are together with such a dangerous creature? What would you do if you don't take any precautions? Of course, I believe that with your teachings, you will definitely be able to make that hunter obedient. But no matter how obedient a loyal dog is, there will always be a time when it goes crazy, right?" Old Foulin glanced at Dudien from the corner of his eyes. He saw that Dudian looked calm, as if he hadn't heard the words. Old Foulin was relieved. Hunters are our guests and partners. I didn't think that Melon Consortium would treat their subordinates like this. It's really sad. I hope that they won't hear these words. Otherwise, it's hard to guarantee that there won't be any trouble. The handsome youth was startled. There was a trace of anger in his eyes. He wanted to attack but was stopped by the girl next to him. I heard that the hunter you recruited was a newcomer of our Melon Consortium. Is his name Dean? The girl asked. Old Foulin narrowed his eyes as he smelled the intention of attack in Dudien's words. He calmly replied, Yes, but Mr. Dean was a good friend of the Ryan family when he joined your consortium. He knew that the Ryan family used to be part of the Melon Consortium. Fortunately, Mr. Dean didn't abandon the Ryan family. He always followed us. The girl thought that old Foulin was cunning. She wanted to use the excuse of poaching to squeeze old Foulin. She didn't expect that the old fox would block her words. Is that so? The handsome youth next to her sneered. I heard that the hunter named Dean committed a crime of theft 3 years ago. He stole the Dragon Mountain ruby from the Milan family. He was sentenced to prison and the magistrate personally reviewed it. This matter shouldn't be false. Aren't you afraid that he would secretly empty your consortium's warehouse? Old Foulin indifferently said, Mr. Dean was wronged. There is a mistake in this. Mr. Dean will complain to the magistrate in the future. Besides, the Dragon Mountain ruby is one of the 3 treasures of the Milan family. It is worrying that the guards are so lax. The handsome youth clenched his fist. He was so angry that his chest was blocked. We can't win against this old fox. The girl whispered to old Foulin. I see that the banquet is about to begin. Are you going to welcome us? Old Foulin indifferently smiled. Since the 2 of you are here, then you should participate together. But it's better to leave the knights outside. It would be impolite if they offend other people. The handsome youth's eyes turned. Patriarch, I suddenly have an idea. We came in a hurry, so we didn't bring any gift. How about we give a little performance to everyone? The other nobles looked at each other, but no one answered. Old Foulin narrowed his eyes. There is no need for gift. How can this old man accept gifts from the younger generation? If you don't give gifts, then this junior will be a little restless. The handsome youth smiled. I have heard that the strength of the hunter surnamed Dean is extraordinary. He is an intermediate hunter. It would be better to let him cooperate with my knights, so that everyone can see the abilities of this hunter. Old Foulin's face sank. He had declared that Dean was an intermediate hunter. It was to create momentum for the consortium. The other side obviously seized this point and took the opportunity to tear him down. Dudian saw that old Foulin was hesitating, so he said, All right, since I can entertain everyone, then I will be happy. He took a few steps forward and smiled at the handsome youth. Milan family, right? You must know that the hunter's skills are mainly focused on killing. I'm not very skilled in pure performance. If I accidentally hurt your subordinates, then please forgive me. The handsome youth looked up and down at Dudian. There was a trace of killing intent in his eyes. However, there was a smile on his face. Same to you. Knights are too upright. If I accidentally hurt you, then I hope you can take care of your body. Dudian glanced at the sword on his waist. It seems that you are also a knight. It would be better for you to show your sincerity. The smile on the handsome youth's face stiffened. He was indeed a knight and had passed the knight's assessment. But after all, he was an aristocrat. The knight's identity was just to gild his body. He didn't delve deeply into it. He was just an official junior knight. In terms of pure combat, he was slightly lacking compared to a junior hunter. He had already learned the information about Dean from the Melon Consortium. He knew that Dean was a junior hunter 3 years ago. Although he hadn't fully mastered the skills of a junior hunter, but he was imprisoned and tortured. But after all, a hunter's physique was still there. Nobles never fight with hunters. The handsome youth said generously. Dudian smiled. But you are also a knight, right? Shouldn't you have the courage of a knight? In the blink of an eye, it was the last day of the month. We were behind by 10 days and 1,000 monthly vote. We were behind by 300 monthly vote. We were short by 700 monthly vote. Well, old Gupta didn't use too much strength. Otherwise he should be able to catch up more. Chapter 180. The handsome youth's face changed. Dudian had used the knight's spirit to force him, so he had no reason to retreat. Although he was an aristocrat, and the knight's identity was just a gilded book. But he had passed through layers of tests to obtain this identity. So he still had some knight spirit. At the moment, under the watchful eyes of the public, even if he tried to defend himself, others would think that he was afraid. There was a surge of anger in his heart. He was about to agree, but the girl next to him suddenly said, "Vic is just a guest who came to congratulate us. How can a guest personally come to the battlefield? You men will inevitably get injured. If you hurt him, then it will be a bit rude." Dean narrowed his eyes as he saw the girl cleverly catch his words. Really? Since a beautiful lady like you can see that he will be injured by me, then there is really no need to compare note. After all, there is a need to interact with each other in order to liven things up. If it is a one-sided fight, then it will lose my grace. The corner of his mouth slightly curved, revealing a faint sarcastic arc. At the moment his back was facing the other nobles, so no one noticed the change in his expression. The handsome youth Vic and the girl could see it clearly. The girl frowned and was about to open her mouth again. Vic suddenly snorted. "Since you are so confident, I would like to see if the hunter is really as powerful as the rumors say." Dudian waved his hand and shook his head. "No, I don't want to hurt you. This lady can see that you are no match for me. Why bother to show off?" The girl frowned. She was trying to exonerate Vic. She didn't expect that her words would become a weakness of Dudian's attack. Vic was riding a tiger and couldn't back down. "Whether I can win or not, we will know after the fight." Vic's eyes were full of murderous intent. "I will liven things up for Patriarch Feline. If you get hurt by my sword, then don't blame me for not reminding you." Dudian shook his head. "I am afraid that I will hurt you and sweep your face. Since it is a fight, it is normal to get injured. You should pay attention to yourself." Vic slowly held the sword at his waist and pulled it out inch by inch. "Get ready to start." "Master, don't." A middle-aged knight hurriedly whispered to stop him. Vic's face sank. "Don't stop me." The middle-aged knight looked at him and sighed. He knew that he wasn't being impulsive, but was forced to fight by the boy who was a few years younger than him. He couldn't help but hate Dean. The girl sighed as she looked at Dudian. She took a few steps back, and came to the edge of the hall under the protection of the knights of the Mel family, so as to avoid being accidentally injured. The smile on Dean's face slowly disappeared. He quietly looked at him and made a gentleman's gesture. "Please." Vic saw a flaw in Dudian's armpit. He suddenly straightened up and thrust his sword. Dean's body flashed. He was like a shadow as he bypassed Vic's sword and arrived in front of Vic. Their eyes stared at each other. Vic's pupils shrank. Although he had expected the hunter's physique to be extraordinary, he didn't think that it would be so much stronger than him. He was about to wave his sword to block, but saw Dean's palm coming towards him. Vic's body retreated a few steps. He staggered and almost fell down. His neck was slightly twisted to the side. His fair and handsome face suddenly became slightly rosy. However, the rosy outline of his face was like a palm print. "Bold!" The middle-aged knight rushed out and stopped in front of Vic. He pulled out the sword from his waist and pointed at Dean. "Damn civilian! Kneel down." Dudian quickly said, "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" Vic recovered from the dizziness. He felt a burning pain on his cheek. His heart was filled with anger as he heard Dean's words. He turned around and was about to scold Dean. However, he almost spat out a mouthful of blood when he saw Dean. He saw Dean holding his palm. His face was full of concern and worry as he looked at his 5 fingers. He repeatedly said, "Did I hurt you? Does it hurt? I'm sorry. I shouldn't have let you suffer like this. What was provocation? What did it mean to bully others too much?" Vic felt that his lungs were going to explode. His blood was boiling as he saw the astonished eyes of the nobles and their children. Although he didn't have a mirror, but he could imagine how embarrassing and shameful he was at the moment. Kill him! Vic's teeth creaked as he roared in anger. The middle-aged knight clenched his sword and stared at Dean coldly. He took a step forward and continued to sweep his sword. His sword was as fast as a streamer. Even the shadow of the sword could be seen in the air. Dean didn't expect the middle-aged knight's physique to be so extraordinary. It should be close to the physique of an intermediate hunter. However, he didn't know whether the knight had magic marks in his body or not. Thinking of this, Dean decided to end the fight quickly. His body continued to retreat. He suddenly raised his hand to feign an attack, but the real move was to sweep his foot. The middle-aged knight's sword chopped at Dean's wrist. He didn't expect Dean to stop halfway. But the middle-aged knight was extremely experienced. He quickly thought that a killing move must be the opposite of a feint. The idea flashed in his mind. His lower body instinctively retreated and narrowly escaped Dean's foot. Dean didn't stare as he didn't hit the middle-aged knight. He quickly moved forward and raised his hand to pinch the middle-aged knight's arm. "Open for me." The middle-aged knight's arm shook. He wanted to block Dean's 5 fingers, but the next moment he felt a sharp pain coming from the part of his arm that was pinched. He couldn't help but raise his other hand to break the siege. Dean reacted quickly. He grabbed the other hand with his right hand. He raised his toe and fiercely hit the middle-aged knight's nose. Bang! The middle-aged knight's head tilted back and blood spurted out of his nose. Dean took this opportunity to raise his right hand and hit the elbow of the middle-aged knight's arm that was pinched. Gotcha! The middle-aged knight's arm that was holding the sword suddenly bent in a terrible posture. The middle-aged knight screamed in pain. He loosened his hand and the sword fell to the ground. The other 3 knights didn't think that their captain would be defeated. They quickly pulled out their swords and rushed up to Dean. Dean punched the middle-aged knight's chest with his left hand. The middle-aged knight was sent flying. He turned around and coldly looked at the other 3 knights. The cold, killing intent in his eyes was like an unrestrained beast. The 3 knights stopped their footsteps. They clenched their swords and trembled as they looked at Dean. Chapter 181. Stop! The girl and old Foulin shouted at the same time. The 3 young knights couldn't help but look at Vic. At the moment, Vic's face was full of horror. He knew how powerful the middle-aged knight was. He was an intermediate knight. Even in the Knights' Hall, he could be ranked in the top 500. How could he be defeated by Dean? Moreover, it was an overwhelming defeat. Didn't this mean that Dean was much stronger than an intermediate knight? As the young master of the Milan family, he naturally knew the gap between a knight and a hunter. Hunters often fought with monsters outside the giant wall. Whether it was combat awareness or killing skills, they were incomparable to knight. Although they were both fighting professions, but the two had different routes. Knights were glorious and protected aristocrat. They were praised by bards. However, hunters were much darker. Even ordinary civilians weren't qualified to know about the existence of hunters. To be able to defeat Uncle Mo so quickly, he is definitely not as simple as a primary hunter. Vic's heart repeatedly turned over this idea. He looked at Dean in horror. The image of hunters in the eyes of aristocrats was not commendable. From the beginning of the birth of this profession, they were labeled as madmen, tyrannical, and so on. Even the aristocrats who had to use hunters to earn wealth were extremely afraid of these existences. This was why senior hunters got preferential treatment from consortiums. Even the aristocrats had to greet them with a smile. Old Foulene, the girl, as well as the aristocrats and their children, were secretly shocked. Some of the aristocratic children were dumbfounded. They couldn't speak a word. In the eyes of these small nobles, there was almost no chance for them to see a hunter in action. They only heard about the danger and strength of a hunter from the mouth of other nobles. In their eyes, the most powerful existence was undoubtedly a knight. But they didn't expect that at this moment, this young boy would be able to defeat a knight wearing an intermediate medal so quickly and neatly. This simply subverted their understanding. Old Foulene was also shocked, but he was more surprised. Although he had heard the description of his strength from Dean's mouth, he wasn't completely convinced. After all, he knew how thin Dean's resume was. He could barely be regarded as a primary hunter. Even if he was witty and cunning, it was still a soft power. Moreover, there would be no blessings from God in prison, only pain and suffering. At the same time, he hurriedly walked out on crutches. He turned to look at Dean and whispered, "Don't be rude." Dean nodded slightly. On the surface, he was just a hunter hired by the consortium. Naturally, he had to be obedient to Old Foulene. It's inevitable to accidentally injure each other. Old Foulene turned his head and apologized to Vic. "Are you okay?" Vic saw Dudien's unapologetic eyes. His chest was suffocating with anger, but he couldn't vent it. He stared at Dudien and waved, "Let's go." Now that things had come to this, he naturally wouldn't pretend to be polite anymore. After all, everyone was well aware of it. The girl sighed and said to Dean, "I didn't expect that such an unpleasant thing would happen today. This is a matter between our consortiums. You are just a hired hunter. Why do you have to intervene? I wanted to ask you for a poem." She shook her head with regret. Dean was startled. He suddenly remembered that the girl's cheeks were a bit familiar. It seemed that she was the daughter of the Mel family, Sarah Mel, whom he had met at the aristocratic gathering. Since it is a matter between consortiums, you shouldn't humiliate a hunter in front of him. Dean stared at her and said in a cold voice, "Although in the eyes of the aristocracy, hunters are just dogs that make money for you. But don't forget that it is the hunters who risk their lives to fight outside the giant wall to send wealth back to the giant wall. The oil lamps that you have lit are taken out of the monsters by the hunters. The fur clothes that you are wearing are peeled from the monsters by the hunters." Sarah sighed and said, "You're right, but this is the hunter's job, isn't it? Moreover, this is your own choice. You can gain a lot of money while taking risks." Dean quietly looked at her beautiful face. Since it is a cooperative relationship, then there should be at least a minimum of respect. Hunters have to work hard to earn what they get. Don't take it for free. Sarah Mel was silent. "You are right. But I have never looked down on hunters. But this is a matter between consortiums and aristocracy. It is not good for you to get involved. By the way, there is one thing I want to tell you. Jenny knows that you are out, but she is locked at home by her father. She can't come out to see you. If you have anything you want to tell her, I can help you pass it to her." Dean's eyes slightly moved, but restored his calmness. He indifferently said, "If there is a will, then no one can lock me up. If there is no intention, then I will be surrounded by giant walls." Sarah Mel looked at him and said, "Are you still holding a grudge against being in prison? It is not her fault." "I know." Dean quietly looked at her. "It is not anyone's fault. I have to thank someone for waking me up. They let me know what the real thing is." "What is it?" Sarah Mel slightly frowned. "Is it hatred?" Dean's eyes swept over her figure. "You should go back." Sarah Mel was slightly stifled. "It is very impolite to expel a lady." "That's why I am not a noble," Dean said. Sarah Mel choked again. Her fingers pulled the hem of her skirt. "I don't know how Jenny talks to you. Every sentence she says can make people angry. Take care." After Sarah Mel and Vic left, Old Foulene took Dean back to the music stage. He said to the crowd, "Everyone, please sit down." It is still early, so let's continue. The nobles looked at him and then looked at Dean. Although many of them were worried about the retaliation of Mel family and Milan family, but old Fouline's side didn't seem to be a good person. Especially the bloody and brutal scene of Dean breaking the middle-aged knight's arm. Everyone was deeply shocked. They were afraid that it would cause Dean to be unhappy. Anyway, they were here. Let's wait until the end of the banquet. The nobles thought to themselves and sat down as they were told. Please continue. Old Fouline raised his hand to the conductor on the stage. The conductor hesitated. He looked at Dean, who was next to him. He felt his scalp tingling. He took 2 deep breaths to restore his mind to a stable state. He turned back to the rest of the orchestra and stood back to his original position. The music slowly rose. The melodious music echoed in the hall. Old Fouline and Dean, who were sitting in the front row, were listening to the music with a smile on their faces. They were enjoying the music. The other nobles in the back looked at Dean from time to time. Various thoughts were running through their minds. The night was getting dark. The nobles returned to their carriages after the banquet. Old Fouline and Dean were at the door. They watched the carriages disappear into the night in front of the manor. Old Fouline said, "Let's go upstairs." Dean nodded. Old Fouline told the butler to change the lamp oil and clean up the hall. He and Dean went to the study on the second floor with the help of the middle-aged maid. After the middle-aged maid left, Old Fouline asked Dean, "Are you hurt?" Dean shook his head. The Milan family and Mel family didn't come to suppress the consortiums. Especially Vic from the Milan family. His target from the beginning seemed to be me. Was it because he knew that I was bailed out and was worried that I would retaliate against them? So, he acted in advance? Chapter 182. So, what was the reason why he attacked me? Dudian asked. Old Fouline pondered for a moment. I remember that 2 years ago, the Milan family seemed to be preparing for a marriage with the Bourong family. I don't know if it was because of this matter. Marriage? Dudian was startled. After a moment, he asked, "What was the result?" It didn't work. Old Fouline shook his head. Miss Jenny of the Bourong family didn't agree. In addition, the Mel family may have secretly intervened to prevent the marriage. After all, once the marriage between the Milan family and the Bourong family is successful, it will form a greater force. The Mel family is the most disadvantageous one in the consortium. Although the Mel family and the Bourong family are friends, but the grudges between the nobles are difficult to explain in a few words. Dudian looked at him. No wonder the Mel family and the Milan family have come to make trouble today. The Mel family's daughter is young, but she doesn't look as simple and ignorant as she looks. Old Fouline smiled. No matter how cunning the fox is, it will eventually be defeated by experience. Dudian nodded and admitted that this was the truth. But today you have humiliated the Milan family in front of them. They won't let you go. Old Fouline sighed. Although we are independent from the Melon consortium, but occasionally we can endure it. Dudian said, "Some I can endure, but some don't deserve to be endured. There is a word called self-humiliation. The Milan family won't spread today's matter. They won't be able to accuse me of offending the nobles. They will only play tricks behind the scenes. But even if we are polite, we shouldn't pray for others to attack since they are hostile." Old Fouline looked at him. He always had an illusion that he wasn't talking to a teenager, but a mature adult in his 30s. He couldn't help but think of some outstanding figures in history. Most of them showed amazing talent in certain aspects when they were children. Perhaps the talent of the youth in front of him would become an outstanding figure in the future, but it would be by no means positive. The Milan family cares about their face, so they won't spread it out. Old Fouline looked at Dudian and said, "But there is no impenetrable wall in the world. The news that you can easily defeat an intermediate knight will spread to the whole circle. Although it won't be reported in the newspapers, but you will become famous in the circle. However, being famous may not be a good thing," Dudian said. Mellon Consortium should take immediate measures. In any case, we have to make money as soon as possible. We have to rent our own passage and cultivate our own hunters. Old Foulin smiled. I can only rely on you. Dudien nodded. He got up and said goodbye as he thought about the small workshop. I'll go back first. By the time he left the Ryan castle, it was already late and the curfew time had arrived. Dudien's carriage was decorated with the flag of the Ryan family. There were curfew soldiers on the road, but they weren't stopped. Back to the small workshop, Dudien checked the materials and confirmed that there were no errors. Then he lay down on the container and went to sleep. The next day, Dudien went to the slave market in the western part of the commercial district. He spent 20 silver coins to pick 20 slaves. Most of the slaves were of the Blanc race. They were healthy. There were 10 men and 10 women. Their age ranged from 18 to 25 years old. Most of the people who sold the slaves were aristocrats, bankrupt wealthy merchants, depressed knights, and so on. They couldn't support too many slaves and servants, so they could only consign them for sale. Dudien didn't directly transfer the ownership of the slaves to his name, but to the Ryan family. He took the slaves to the small workshop that he had rented. He taught them the simple production process. Each person only needed to learn how to make their own environment. Dudien selected a middle-aged man called Harrison, who was a butler of a knight family. He replaced him to manage the workshop. Throughout the day, Dudien taught the slaves how to make and supervise their work. In the evening, Dudien counted the finished goods. There were less than 1,000 boxes. The cost of the materials is about 2 silver coins. If I want to sell the matches quickly, I have to enter the market at a very low price. Each box is 2 copper coins. 1,000 boxes is 20 silver coins. The revenue ratio is 10 to 1. Dudien calculated in his mind. Yes, the first thing he made was the match. Although in alchemy, the match was not classified as a forbidden technique like explosive. The alchemy structure of the match was relatively simple. Yellow phosphorus, red phosphorus, and other basic materials could be used and combined. But in this period without electricity, the match could quickly replace the fire sickle. After all, the ignition efficiency of the fire sickle was slow and the weight was heavy. These 2 points would be defeated by the advantage of the mat. Although the match was only a small item, but it was a consumable. It meant that there would always be a demand. Once the match replaced the position of the fire sickle, the money earned would not be inferior to other precious items. 20 silver coins a day is too slow. 10 days is only 2 gold coins. Dudien thought about the previous production process. The work efficiency of the 20 slaves was very fast. The reason why only 1,000 boxes were made was that the process of cutting the matchsticks took the most time. 10 slaves cutting the matchsticks couldn't catch up with the speed of the others making the matchsticks and the boxes. I have to build a machine to cut the matchsticks, Dudien thoughtfully said, but the emergence of machinery is bound to be noticed by people. Then they will start to research and develop it. Other consortia can rely on their powerful financial resources and channels to make me the inventor unable to find any market. I can only starve to death. In that case, it is better to personally open up the steam era. Dudien's eyes were secretly firm. If others copied his products, then he would make sure that the speed of copying couldn't catch up with the speed of his invention. After renting a few dilapidated houses for the slaves to live in, Dudien returned overnight to the Ryan castle. The carriage had just entered the yard town. Suddenly, the horses in front of the carriage screamed in panic. The carriage was shaking from side to side. The coachman was worried that he would disturb Dudien. He angrily waved his whip and shouted. Dudien came back to his senses. He lifted the curtain and looked out. There was nothing on the street in the dark night. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.